But who really was Zarathustra? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes alive and each video immerses you in the fate of those who shaped the world. Today, let's go back more than 3,000 years to the heart of the ancient plains of Iran. A man rises, bearing a new vision, Zarathustra, the prophet who dares to defy the ancient gods and proclaim the existence of a single supreme principle, Ahura Mazda. He announces the eternal struggle between light and darkness, between truth and lie. His words, transmitted in the Avesta, will inspire empires, influence religions, and cross the centuries to reach us. But behind the myth, an enigma remains. Who really was Zarathustra? But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and have a nice trip. Between 2600 before Christ, a vast movement of technological, political, and cultural transformations shapes the ancient world, from Anatolia to the Indus Valley. Metallurgical innovations, agricultural advances, and the expansion of trade networks foster the rise of kingdoms and city-states. It is also a period of cultural exchanges, the emergence of new alphabets, and renewed religious practices, demonstrating that the ancient world was much more connected than we imagine. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age marks a turning point. In the Mediterranean basin, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and up to the foothills of the Himalayas, blacksmiths perfect iron metallurgy, which is more difficult to master than bronze. The Hittites of Anatolia play a pioneering role in these techniques, paving the way for more durable agricultural tools and weapons. In the Indus Valley, new irrigation systems support demographic growth and the emergence of prosperous cities. Powerful empires then structured the ancient space. In Babylon, the Kassite domination, between 1595 and 1155, before Christ, ensures the continuity of the Mesopotamian tradition and maintains its role as a commercial and cultural crossroads. In Egypt, the New Kingdom, from 1550 to 1070 before Christ, reaches its peak under sovereigns like Thutmose III. In China, the Shang dynasty, from 1600 to 1046 before Christ, imposes a theocratic monarchy and develops oracle-bone script before being replaced by the Zhou in 1046 before Christ, who established the mandate of heaven. In the Aegean world, Mycenaean kingdoms prosper between the 16th and 12th centuries before Christ, with their palaces in Mycenae, Pylos, or Terans, and the use of linear B script. These societies, whether Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Chinese, or Aegean, are distinguished by complex administrations, supported agriculture, strong military traditions, and diplomacy based on the exchange of goods, princesses, and sometimes cultic customs. This period is characterized by the rise of trade routes linking distant regions. Merchants crossed Central Asia to obtain Afghan tin, essential for bronze production. The lapis lazuli from Badakhshan in northeastern Afghanistan reaches Mesopotamia and Egypt, where it is used for sacred ornamentation. By this time, Proto-Chinese silk fabrics circulate westward, indicating early exchanges between China and the Near East. Amber from the Baltic Sea, prized for its rarity, transits through Central Europe along the Amber Road. These exchanges create an intercultural network where objects, ideas, and techniques circulate. Mediterranean ships transport wine, oils, and ores, while camel and horse caravans link river ports and political centers. Around 1200 before Christ, a major collapse strikes the Mycenaean colonies, the Hittite civilization, and several cities of the Levant. This late Bronze Age experiences a crisis attributed to various factors: climate change, disasters, economic instability, wars, or invasions. The Sea Peoples, mentioned by Egyptian sources and including possibly the Philistines, contribute to the destabilization of the Eastern Mediterranean. This period witnesses the fall of great kingdoms, the decline of long-distance trade, and the contraction of urban centers. Egypt partially repels the invaders, but its influence weakens, while Babylon experiences disruptions. The Near East politically reconfigures. Tyre and Sidon increase their maritime and commercial power. This era remains marked by the memory of destructions and the idea of a historical turning point. Despite upheavals, decisive cultural transmissions continue. The first Semitic alphabets, derived from hieroglyphs in cuneiform, simplify writing. The Phoenician alphabet, spread by trade, influences Greek and Aramaic scripts, paving the way for Latin and Arabic alphabets. In the Ganges Valley and Punjab, the Vedic hymns in ancient Sanskrit, compiled in the Rig Veda, establish a lasting religious tradition. In eastern Anatolia, the Hurrians and Urartians developed their own mythology, in contact with the Hittites, Assyrians, and Persians. Epic tales transmitted orally by bards reinforce identity cohesion. These literary and religious traditions interact, producing borrowings, syncretisms, and cultural foundations for the following centuries. Iranian ecosystems hold a special place. Situated between Mesopotamia and Central Asia, the Iranian plateaus mix arid steppes, fertile foothills, oases, and waterways. Mastery of these requires a combined management of agriculture and pastoralism. The first communities of herders benefit from horse domestication, a decisive asset for mobility, warfare, and transport. According to archaeology, the expansion of Indo-Iranian herders is part of the movement of tribes from the Central Asian steppes linked to the Andronovo culture in the second millennium before Christ. These populations migrate in several waves to the Iranian foothills and the northwestern Indian subcontinent. Their semi-nomadic lifestyle relies on horse breeding, but also on rituals valuing the sacred strength of fire and oral hymnody. Later sources report that they bring a religious framework structured around a common pantheon and a tripartite social organization: priests, warriors, herders. Iran's climatic diversity between alpine, desert, and semi-arid areas imposes varied survival modes ranging from pastoralism to irrigation. This constraint stimulates inventiveness, as evidenced by the development of qanats, underground galleries designed to capture groundwater and convey it to distant plots. Although their exact origin remains uncertain, they appear very early as an ingenious solution to the arid environment. The major regional powers, Babylon, Hittite kingdoms, and Mesopotamian cities, interact with Iran to secure raw materials and expand their influence. Indo-Iranian tribes sometimes serve as mercenaries, settlers, or commercial mediators. The newly domesticated horse facilitates more mobile military strategies and gives an advantage to peoples who integrate cavalry. Each incursion or alliance leads to exchanges, agricultural techniques, ritual formulas, decorative motifs. Some beliefs cross borders, fueling common myths reinterpreted according to local traditions. Routes linking Central Asia to Bactria, then to Persia and Mesopotamia, carry goods and spiritual practices: viticulture, camel domestication, painted ceramics, goldsmithing. These circulations stimulate the prosperity of the regions traversed. At the turn between the second and first millennium before Christ, the world undergoes profound changes. The Iron Age progresses, but ancient rites do not disappear. They overlay innovations, creating hybrid societies in armament as well as in culture. Agricultural progress, sturdier plows, new seeds, boosts productivity and encourages the sedentarization of former nomads. Rulers take advantage of these surpluses to fund their campaigns, erect monuments, and feed their armies. Writing, increasingly widespread, serves accounting, power archives, sacred texts, and epics. From the Near East to China, this written culture strengthens the coherence of political authority and contributes to its legitimacy over time. Between 800 and 600 before Christ, new political configurations emerged. In Mesopotamia, Babylon and Assyria competed for hegemony. The Assyrian Empire, under conquering kings like Ashurbanipal in the 7th century before Christ, imposed itself militarily as far as Egypt, while Babylon retained a cultural aura. In Asia Minor, small kingdoms descended from the Hittites appeared, such as Phrygia under King Midas, or Urartu in the valley of the Iraqs and Lake Van. The Phoenician cities maintained their essential role in Mediterranean trade, facing emerging Greek competition. To the east, the Zhou dynasty in China began the Spring and Autumn period, from the 8th to the 5th century before Christ, a prelude to the Warring States. In the Iranian Peninsula, tribal confederations formed, including the Medes, destined to play a major role in the 7th century before Christ. These dynamics shaped roads, exchanges, and human landscapes. Scribes, merchants, and travelers transmitted tales, techniques, and knowledge, while Babylon continued its celestial catalogs, and Egypt perfected mummification. By the end of this period, iron had become a common material, societies armed themselves heavily, religious practices diversified, and alphabets were refined. Some cities appeared, others disappeared, while the Iranian plains remained a crossroads between nomads and settlers. The interest of kings and priests in the stars and divination intensified, and the first philosophical writings emerged. Craftsmanship became more refined. Bronzes, goldsmithery, ivories, and polychrome frescoes adorned palaces and temples. Oral traditions, which had become the foundation of ethical reflections, already carried questions about the divine, the universe, and human values. Thus, between 2000 and 600 powers. Before Christ, many foundations of ancient history crystallized. The Indo-Iranian tribes from the steppes of Central Asia played a major role in the cultural and linguistic history of Eurasia. They originated in the Andronovo culture, active between 2000 and 900 before Christ, extending from Kazakhstan to southwestern Siberia, up to the Volga and the Urals. Excavations reveal a structured society: horse breeding, chariots, rudimentary metallurgy, the use of bronze for weapons and tools. This economic base favored their mobility and gradual expansion towards Iran, then towards northwestern India. The Indo-Iranian tribes spoke languages from the large Indo-European family. The similarities between the Vedic Sanskrit of the oldest Indian hymns, Avestan, the sacred language of Zoroastrianism, and Gathic, the archaic form of Avestan, show a common origin. Shared lexical roots, grammatical structures, and poetic formulas reveal a tradition born in the northern steppes and spread by migratory waves. Parallels like Soma, Hyoma, or Diva Daiva confirm the existence of a unique cultural matrix before the divergence between ancient India and Iran. The Indo-Iranian migrations probably began before 1500 before Christ and continued until the first millennium. Their causes remain debated: climate changes, pressures from neighboring populations, economic and political needs. They followed two main directions: towards the Iranian plains on one side and beyond the Hindu Kush, towards the Indus Valley, then the Ganges on the other. This dual orientation marked the religious and cultural configuration of these regions. A common Proto-Indo-Iranian trunk already existed a few centuries before the distinction between Old Sanskrit, used in the Rig Veda hymns, dated between 1500 and 1200 before Christi, and Avestan. The Gathic, more conservative, reflects an older stage, marked by grammar and vocabulary close to steppe origins. The poetic structure, based on short oral verses, reveals a common technique linked to ritual practices. The Brahmins in India and the Zoroastrian priests of Iran, later called Magi, transmitted these traditions orally over long periods. The social organization of these communities was based on three functions: priests, warriors, and herders. The priests ensured worship and the link with the divine, the warriors guaranteed military protection, and the herders ensured economic subsistence. Myths and sacred stories reflected this tripartition and a cosmic vision centered on balance and order: Asha in Iran and RTA in India. The common pantheon of the Indo-Iranian populations illustrates the lineage between the Vedic religion of India and the ancient Iranian religion. The gods are called Deva in Sanskrit and Deva in Avestan, two terms derived from the same root. Originally, they referred to luminous and celestial deities associated with benevolence. However, in the Iranian branch, which saw the emergence of Zoroaster's teachings, the Deva took on a negative connotation, linked to false deities, whereas in the Indian branch, the Deva retained a positive meaning in opposition to the Asura. This evolution reflects the transition from a common belief to two distinct traditions. Fire already occupied a sacred place, perceived as an intermediary between men and gods. It was used to carry offerings, plants, clarified butter, libations, to celestial powers. Diligently maintained in cultic spaces, it formed the heart of religious and community life. Its lighting, protection, and maintenance were entrusted to priests. In the Vedic hymns, Agni, the personified fire, is praised as a divine messenger. In Avestan, Attar embodies the sacred essence of fire. A ritual drink also marked this common cult: Soma in the Vedic tradition and Haoma in the Iranian tradition. Derived from a sacred plant, perhaps a variety of ephedra, they were prepared by filtering and consecrated with hymns. This beverage symbolized life, warrior strength, and immortality. Its consumption, accompanied by chants and shared collectively, strengthened group cohesion. Sacred speech played a central role. The Vedic hymns, sung in archaic Sanskrit, and the Gathas, recited in Gathic, asserted that the correct pronunciation of mantras preserved the world's balance. An error could alter the transmission of the sacred text, hence a strict discipline, orally transmitted, to mark each accent and vowel. The priest had to respect a precise order of recitation associated with gestures and offerings, so that the word deployed all its power. The mobility of the Indo-Iranians, supported by their mastery of horseback riding and chariots of war, facilitated their settlement in various regions. Upon entering the high Iranian plains, they encountered local cultures and mingled with the populations of the Bactrian and Margian oases. This area, later called Bactria Margiana, reveals a marked syncretism: rudimentary fire temples, containers decorated with symbols related to offerings, rich tombs with bronze weapons, jewelry, and seals. As they settled, their practices diversified while retaining the religious heritage of the steppes. The link between language and religion is particularly strong in this process. The Vedic texts emphasize the accuracy of Sanskrit pronunciation, indispensable for the validity of sacrifices. Similarly, the Gathas, the oldest layer of the Avesta, use a metric system and an archaic vocabulary originating from a common heritage. The figure of the priest-singer existed in both the Vedic and Avestan worlds as the custodian of knowledge and mediator with the sacred. Even before the establishment of Zoroastrianism, some doctrinal elements, like the opposition between truth and falsehood, Asha against Druj in Iran, RTA against Anarta in India, were already conceptualized. The social tripartition was reflected in the sanctification of essential functions. At the top, priests responsible for relations with the divine, then warriors, equipped with the horse, chariot, and bronze weapons, and finally herders and farmers, who guaranteed agricultural and pastoral production. In both Iran and India, cattle breeding, cereal cultivation, and irrigation ensured the food base. These three functions embodied a cosmic order to be preserved. The Indo-Iranian pantheon reflects this balance. It includes Mitra, associated with contracts and daylight, and Varuna, the guardian of cosmic laws. The Indo-Iranians of the Central Asian steppes practiced a cult of natural elements and powers. During their migrations, they carried stories, prayers, and worldviews, which they adapted. The split between the worship of Deva and the demonization of Deva in Iran reveals a religious readjustment. The Gathic texts reinforce this evolution by emphasizing moral values and ritual purity. In northwestern India, the Indo-Aryans introduced Vedic Sanskrit, of which the Rig Veda stands as a major testament. Its hymns emphasize the proper execution of sacrifice, accompanied by mantras and the preparation of soma. The parallel with the Iranian haoma shows a common ritual, a sacred plant pressed to give a consecrated drink, elevating the spirit and a source of blessing. The warrior and cosmic aspects, notably related to Indra, intertwine with philosophical prayers, paving the way for an elaborate theology. In Iran, this cultural matrix evolved under the influence of prophets and reformers who sought to purify the worship. The emerging Zoroastrianism emphasizes the sincerity of the sacred word and a dualistic morality opposing truth and falsehood. The rituals retained ancient traits: sacred fire, liquid offerings, tripartite society, reverence for the word. But some practices were rejected as superstitious or corruptive, attributed to the worshippers of Deva. This tension, less marked in India, became a major driver of differentiation. Gradually, the Avestan language derived from Proto-Indo-Iranian towards more recent forms, distinguishing the Gathic, the most archaic, from the later Avestan, associated with the Yashts and the Zoroastrian liturgy. These tribes coexisted with other populations in Iran, notably Elamites and, later, Semitic communities from Mesopotamia. The interactions shaped the cultural mosaic of the Iranian plateau. The new arrivals sometimes adopted local gods, but also transmitted their poetic recitations, codes of purity, and ethical vision, leaving a lasting mark on the region. The Indo-Iranians, whether they migrated to northwestern India or Iran, carried with them a set of beliefs and social structures already developed: respect for the fire, sacred drink, soma, haoma, ritual chant, hierarchical pantheon, and functional tripartition of society. The priests ensured the cult and the word, alongside a warrior aristocracy and farmer herders as guarantors of material balance. This cultural matrix gave rise to Vedic Hinduism and Zoroastrianism. Despite regional and chronological variations, several fundamental traits endured. The vocabulary related to the priest, Brahman, Athravan, sacred chant, mantra, mantra, and ritual drink, soma, hauma, shows common roots. The symbolism of the fire, purifying and linking with the divine, is found both in Zoroastrianism and in the role of Agni in Hinduism. The foundational Vedic, Gathic, and Avestan texts retain the trace of this shared heritage born from the steppes of Central Asia. The Indo-Iranian impact was also manifested through the diffusion of linguistic traits, cult practices, and social conceptions around the Hindu Kush and Iranian plateau. Later sources confirm that a warrior elite from the steppe managed to impose or merge their model with local customs, giving birth to new kingdoms. This crucible gave rise to the Aryan kingdoms of the Indus Valley and Gangetic Basin, as well as the first political amalgamations in Iran, paving the way for the Medes and then the Achaemenids. What characterizes the Indo-Iranian heritage is the intertwining of religion, language, and society into a cohesive whole. The sacred word, transmitted orally in the form of hymns, served as an identity cement, moral code, and spiritual innovation. The fire rituals, a bridge between the earthly and celestial worlds, unified warriors, shepherds, and peasants. The distinction between Deva and Daiva foreshadowed the future split between Hinduism in India and Zoroastrianism in Iran. The sacred drink soma, haoma, symbolized the fusion of the natural and the sacred in a collective ritual. The migrations from Central Asia to Iran and the Indus show that these groups were not only conquerors or shepherds, but carriers of a vision valuing priesthood, military honor, and economic activity, attributing to fire, in the word, a quasi-divine power. Their organization, based on tri-functionality, influenced Iranian and Indian societies beyond the second millennium before Christ. The Gathic, Vedic Sanskrit, and Avestan, carriers of poetry, liturgy, and theology, bear witness to this. This collective heritage remains alive and continues to nourish the spiritual and cultural foundation of millions of people today. The identity of Zarathustra, called Zoroaster by the Greeks, remains debated regarding its historicity and time period. The Gathas, in the Old Avestan dialect and directly attributed to the prophet, provide the closest account of his thought. Conversely, Greco-Roman authors like Plato, Xenophon, or Plutarch offer a distorted vision, fueling an unfinished historical quest. Three hypotheses dominate the dating of Zarathustra. The very high hypothesis places him between the 17th and 15th century before Christ, based on linguistic criteria linking Gathic to ancient Indo-Iranian forms. The middle hypothesis places him between the 12th and 10th century before Christ, in connection with the tribal evolution of the Medes. The low hypothesis places him in the 7th or 6th century before Christ, identifying King Vishtaspa as a historical ruler. The very high dating relies on two clues: the archaic Avestan of the Gathas, close to Vedic Sanskrit, and archaeological evidence of Proto-Iranian cultures in the Bactria-Margiana Bronze Age, possible frameworks for his teachings. The Zoroastrian message would have then spread over a long period before its compilation. The middle dating places Zarathustra at a time of migrations and tribal reorganizations on the Iranian plateau. Avestan already shows evolutions compared to Gathic, and the allusions to conflicts with the Turanians recall the oral traditions of the Medes. Zarathustra would have proposed his reform in a context of instability, where the themes of the duel between truth, Asha, and lie, Diaruj, responded to a need for new religious benchmarks. The low hypothesis draws a connection between the royal support mentioned in the Gathas and a monarch from western Iran, identified as Vishtaspa. Some think that Zarathustra lived shortly before the rise of Cyrus the Great, in a phase of political reconfiguration. This late dating coincides with the Zoroastrian influence and the rise of a centralized state conducive to the spread of a reformist religion. Several disciplines are mobilized to differentiate these hypotheses. Paleolinguistics compares Gathic to Vedic Sanskrit, notably its ancient diphthongs. Paleoastronomy examines the cosmic references of the texts to find potential stellar configurations. Archaeology seeks ritual traces related to Ahura Mazda. Ritual comparison highlights prayer, the sacred fire, and Haoma, the equivalent of Vedic Soma. The break with blood sacrifice and the affirmation of ethical dualism mark the originality of Zoroastrianism, whether it's an early reform or a late evolution. The status of Zarathustra remains disputed. Some see him as a unique prophet, author of the core of the Gathas, others as a progressive compilation attributed to a founding master. Mnemonic techniques favored faithful transmission, but left room for later additions, complicating the identification of a historical author. Greco-Roman sources feed the imagination more than chronology. Plato mentions Persian wisdom without a precise date. Xenophon describes a Cyrus instructed by magi, possible heirs of the tradition. Plutarch attributes astrological and magical practices to Zoroaster, perpetuating the image of an Oriental mage. These accounts reflect Greek admiration for the East, but offer fragmented data interpreted through varied cultural prisms. Debates on Zarathustra's chronology rely notably on his relationship with the Kavi-Vishtaspian dynasty mentioned in the Avesta. Several Kavi kings appear as potential protectors of the prophet, but their identification with real figures remains uncertain. For some, it's a legendary lineage symbolizing royal support for Zoroastrianism. For others, a line of Median kings or Iranian tribal chiefs. Oral traditions might have retroactively projected illustrious names to legitimize the cult. Astronomical allusions in the late part of the Avesta describe constellations or planetary alignments observable in ancient times, but the manuscripts, compiled after the Sassanid era, might diverge from the original text. Some titles linked to Zarathustra also pose a problem. According to the translation, he appears as a priest, poet, or visionary leader. The question arises as to whether an isolated individual can initiate a lasting reform. Proponents of a single master emphasize the coherence of the Gathas, attributed to a remarkable personality. Others believe that in a tribal context, several officiants contributed to the hymns, merging various traditions, and that Zarathustra became an emblem consolidated by centuries of recitation. The absence of administrative or political documentation further complicates dating. No archival text mentions Zarathustra. In some Achaemenid inscriptions, Ahura Mazda is invoked as the supreme god, without explicit reference to the prophet. Persepolitan art can be read as reflecting an already established Zoroastrianism, or an older cult centered on the sun and fire. The analysis of rituals, notably the yasna, reveals layers where fire coexists with other deities, indicating an intermediate stage between Indo-Iranian polytheism and Zoroastrian monotheism. If these sections predate the Gathas, Zarathustra would be later. If, on the contrary, the Gathas are the oldest strata, All else becomes adaptation. Each archaeological or linguistic clue fuels the discussion among very high, medium, or low datings. In the absence of political archives and external confirmation, none prevails. Paleoastronomy, ritual analysis, and linguistic comparison continue the investigation. New discoveries, whether Avestan fragments or archaeological evidence, will renew the debates. The uncertainties about the figure of Zarathustra remain a major challenge for historiography. Experts agree that Zarathustra was born into an environment where family piety and sacred rites punctuated life. His birthplace is located in the Iranian cultural area, sometimes called Ahura Mazda, mentioned in the Avestan tradition. Some place it in the northeast of the Iranian plateau, others in Bactria Margiana, a vast area corresponding to northern Afghanistan and southern Turkmenistan. Still, others mention eastern Azerbaijan in the northwest of Iran. These regions combine fertile plains, rugged terrains, essential waterways for agriculture, and village communities inheriting the ancient Indo-Iranian world. Linked to the Central Asian steppes, they combined migratory traditions and agricultural sedentarism. Hot, dry summers, harsh winters forced the populations to develop survival strategies, crop storage, transhumance, and rudimentary irrigation. The contact between nomads and settlers fostered a multicultural fabric. In the markets, cereals, livestock, bronze objects, but also mythological stories and religious knowledge were exchanged. It is in this context that the Spitama family, to which Zarathustra belonged, was inscribed. This lineage, renowned for its role as firekeepers, occupied a central position in community life. The fire cult, considered a bridge between the material world and the divine sphere, demanded maintaining a clear flame and preserving the purity of the altars. The Spitama, religious mediators, recited mantras intended to reinforce cosmic harmony. A child born in this lineage received ritual education very early on: choice of wood, art of lighting, respect for purity rules. From childhood, boys were initiated into the Indo-Iranian liturgical language. They learned sacred vocabulary, invocations, and the pronunciation of mantras. The young Zarathustra seems to have shown a particular talent for memorization, an essential quality in an oral culture. The Spitama priests recited in unison, passing down their knowledge from generation to generation. These formulas were supposed to protect herds, heal the sick, and ensure good harvests. They were accompanied by codified gestures, offerings, ritual movements, sprinkling of consecrated water. Thus, Zarathustra grew up in a universe where speech, thought, and action were inseparable. In priestly education, the Haoma cult was taught, a ritual drink prepared from a mysterious plant. Considered a divine elixir enhancing vitality and discernment, it was picked or substituted, crushed, filtered, mixed with water, then consecrated. The ceremony was accompanied by chants, offerings, and flower cakes. The Haoma, a symbol of purity and strength, had to be consumed piously. These rites, invoking a supernatural presence, marked Zarathustra, who understood that the substance altered the state of consciousness and invited reflection on the world's invisible forces. His social environment was complex: clan chiefs concerned with their authority, nomadic warriors protecting herds and borders, rival priests defending different cults. Some groups favored blood sacrifices, others the purity of fire and the just word. As a young man, Zarathustra witnessed theological disputes and epic narratives passed down orally, mixing legends, hymns, and ritual ordinances, fueling spiritual reflection. He is said to have visited several localities with his family or itinerant masters. Religious gatherings brought together priests and students to exchange liturgical techniques and prepare community ceremonies, weddings, purifications, agricultural festivals. This diversity allowed him to confront his lineage's traditions with other doctrines in a context where debates arose about the nature of the deities. As he grew older, Zarathustra gained a reputation as a sage, attentive to the political and spiritual tensions related to the cults. Animal sacrifice was one of the points of contention. Followers of warrior deities made it a central rite, while other priests, attached to fire, denounced its excess. A moral spirit could then doubt the real value of these practices for the cosmic order. This apprenticeship, enriched by oral texts and ritual observations, prepared Zarathustra for his future revelation. Around the age of 30, the age at which a man was expected to take on responsibilities in Indo-Iranian cultures, he is said to have had a mystical vision. While praying by a river or at a sacred site, he received the revelation of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity. Around him appeared the Amisha Spenta, beneficent entities representing spiritual and moral principles, such as good mind, vohu mana, and just righteousness, asha vahishta. Zarathustra then became aware of a new truth, the existence of a single wise god, Ahura Mazda, surrounded by divine principles that guarantee order and justice. The shock of this encounter was probably all the more intense as it contrasted with the polytheistic or dualistic environment in which he had been raised. These luminous beings exemplifying virtue and cosmic balance offered him a vision that surpassed the usual tribal deities. For a young priest trained in the recitation of mantras, the manifestation of Ahura Mazda and the Amesha Spenta embodied the culmination of a quest for meaning. The importance of speech, just thought, and deliberate action was sublimated, since each sacred word, uttered with right-mindedness, could align with the divine will. The effects of this revelation, a feeling of inner certainty, a moral impetus against injustice and deceit, were integrated into the continuation of his life. Tradition holds that this decisive event truly marked the beginning of Zarathustra's mission. Without presuming the immediate political or religious consequences, one can well imagine that the rupture was profound from a theological standpoint. Returning to a household still strongly attached to traditional cults and announcing that only one supreme deity existed, surrounded by abstract and ethical concepts, was bound to raise questions and, sooner or later, resistance. The Spitama, for their part, could welcome the emphasis on the sacred fire as a symbol of purity, but also had to accept that the very notion of divinity was evolving towards an emerging monotheism. The faith in Ahura Mazda, associated with the Amesha Spenta, reinterpreted the old practices rather than completely severing them. The fire retained its sacred function, but it now pointed to the light of a single divine source, giving a new meaning to all ritual words. Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of the Mazdian doctrine, transcends the material and corruptible world. In the Gathas attributed to Zarathustra, though some passages undoubtedly stem from his disciples, he appears as the creator of the world, defined by omniscience, wisdom, and benevolence. His name means wise lord, or lordly wisdom. Around him gravitate the Amesha Spenta, beneficial emanations of his power, and the Daiva, malevolent forces opposed to the cosmic order. The Amisha Spenta, called benevolent immortals, each embody a quality, vohu mana, good thought, asha vahishta, best truth or righteousness, spenta armaiti, devotion, kshathra vairya, ideal power, harvatat, wholeness, and amaritat, immortality. They guide humanity towards justice and truth. The Daiva, associated with falsehood and chaos, symbolize the forces that lead people away from virtue. They do not constitute an autonomous eternal principle. They represent a deviation arising from bad human choices. Zoroastrianism is based on a non-ontological dualism. Good and evil are not two equal forces. Ahura Mazda remains the sole source of creation. The world is structured between Asha, the truth and order, and Druj, the lie and disorder. The real struggle takes place within each individual through their thoughts, words, and actions. This responsibility relies on a triple requirement: humata, good thought, hukta, good word, and huvarshta, good deed. Following Asha is to support Ahura Mazda's divine plan. Succumbing to Druj is to nourish chaos. In rituals and prayers, the faithful praise Ahura Mazda and the Amesha Spenta while committing to fight falsehood and violence. Historically, this emphasis on individual responsibility has fostered a religiosity focused on ethics and personal effort rather than ritual sacrifices or polytheistic worship. In Zoroastrian doctrine, time is conceived as linear, contrary to Indo-Iranian traditions that favor a cyclical view. The original creation establishes order, asha, but the infiltration of falsehood, druj, creates increasing tension. The cosmos is shaped in 7 symbolic stages: sky, water, earth, plants, animals, humanity, and fire. Each is placed under the protection of an Amesha Spenta. But the presence of evil leads to a final confrontation between truth and deception. This conflict ends with the frashakareti, the renewal of the world. Creation is purified, and souls are judged according to their thoughts, words, and deeds. The righteous join Ahura Mazda's perfection, while deceivers suffer the harm they have caused. However, this is not eternal damnation. All creation is destined to be restored and reintegrated. This redemptive perspective left a lasting mark on Zoroastrianism, notably under the Achaemenid and Sasanian dynasties. Fire rituals hold a central place. Fire is not worshipped as a deity, but honored as a manifestation of purity and Ahura Mazda's presence. In temples, priests maintain an eternal flame, a symbol of truth and knowledge, whose extinction would represent an attack on sacred continuity. Purity is a fundamental principle, extending beyond fire to encompass all creation: water, earth, air, and natural elements. Texts prescribe respect for nature and rules of spiritual and bodily hygiene. To profane these elements is to corrupt the cosmic order willed by Ahura Mazda. Priests have thus established rules to preserve springs, rivers, sacred spaces, and encourage the faithful to maintain purity in their homes and actions. Hama water holds a particular place. It should not be confused with ordinary water, though the term sometimes refers to the plant or the ritual drink. A sacred preparation obtained by pressing plants, Hama was believed to give strength and wisdom. It later acquired symbolic value for purification. Drinking Hama, or offering it on the fire altar, expressed a desire to draw closer to Ahura Mazda and receive his support against deception. Some texts associate it directly with Harvatat, the Amesha Spenta of wholeness, representing spiritual integrity and health. The Haoma ceremony sometimes included prayers in honor of Ahura Mazda and a request for ethical enlightenment. Zoroastrian priests, called mages in Greek sources or athrivans in the Avesta, ensured the proper execution of these rituals. The sacred word played an essential role. Incantations invoked the Amesha Spenta and repelled the Daiva. But they were not reserved for priests. Many families learned some verses or prayers to recite each morning in front of the home hearth, making daily life an act of devotion. The connection between physical and moral purity is also evident in funerals. During and after the Sassanid era, dakmas, or towers of silence, were used where bodies were exposed to vultures and the elements to avoid polluting the earth or fire. The soul then departed from the body to face judgment. The rituals of the 3rd, 10th, and 30th days recalled the struggle between Asha and Druj until the final rebirth, fertility. In the background, the same idea always returns. The Amesha Spenta embody good, supported by truth, generosity, and harmony, while the Deva symbolize evil, born of corruption, violence, and lies. Human existence becomes the main battlefield of this opposition, without ontological equality. Ahura Mazda remains the predominant principle, the guarantor of creation, and its completion in fertility. Hence the constant exhortations of the texts to inner vigilance. Every gesture and every word affect the world's balance. The Zoroastrian doctrine of Ahura Mazda has marked several eras and influenced other religions. The idea of an individual judgment of souls after death is found in certain Judeo-Christian branches and in Islam, and the concept of a final battle may have inspired representations of good and evil in Christian millenarianism and Islamic eschatology. But, in its original form, Zoroastrianism emphasizes the freedom of each individual, capable of achieving the best or the worst, not to please a jealous deity, but to participate in the Creator's work of truth. This ethic is found in the Avestan prayers, which praise Ahura Mazda for his mercy while calling for the world to be preserved from defilement. It is recommended to protect livestock, not to pollute waterways, to preserve the sacred flame, to act with fairness. Lying and slander are considered serious faults because they propagate druj and disrupt harmony. Zoroastrianism stresses the balance between the spiritual and material. The fire and purity rituals are part of the quest for Asha. The flame is a channel of divine presence. The Hyoma, water, symbolizes the vital and purifying force of Ahura Mazda. The work of the earth and the care of animals participate in the order desired by the Creator. The faithful is thus invited to develop an ethical and ecological consciousness. Every element of creation has a place in the divine sphere, and the world is entrusted to humanity to manage it responsibly. The great seasonal festivals, called Gahambars, remind of the necessity to thank the Amesha Spenta and ask for their support against corruption. The creation stories in 7 stages reinforce this respect. Man, capable of supporting or thwarting divine will, occupies a prominent place. Animals, plants, soil, air, and water are components of the cosmic puzzle overseen by Ahura Mazda. Prayers at sunrise and sunset reaffirm this sacred link and remind of the moral duty to preserve harmony. Although Zoroastrianism recognizes the antagonism between good and evil, it is not created by Ahura Mazda as an independent entity. It corresponds to a mistaken choice, a deviation from Asha. The Daiva are extreme manifestations of this rebellion, while the Amesha Spenta support the possibility for man to straighten out and participate in the divine plan. This duality gives the Zoroastrian faith a tone of hope mixed with warning. At the end of earthly life, individual judgment is symbolized by the Chinvat bridge, mentioned in the Avesta. Broad and easy to cross for those who follow Asha, it narrows and becomes impassable for those who choose deceit. This image underlines personal responsibility. Each act produces its consequences. The eschatology of Frashokareti affirms the final victory of good. Despite wars and lies, creation, born of the wisdom of Ahura Mazda, will lead to perfect harmony. Humanity is invited to cooperate with God, who has given it freedom, to make truth triumph. The rites, the fire cult, the preservation of purity, and prayers to Ahura Mazda and the Amesha Spenta maintain the tension between ethics and metaphysics. Inner and outer purity aims to align with Asha and repel Druj. Frashokareti remains the ultimate horizon of a restored world, where lies, without ontological foundation, will be defeated by truth. The first troubles appeared when Zarathustra, confident in his reforms, clashed with the Kavas, traditional priests attached to animal sacrifices. They saw ritual slaughter as an ancestral link with the divine forces. Questioning this system amounted, in their view, to denying an age-old tradition and breaking the cosmic balance. According to Zarathustra, bloody sacrifices had to be abandoned in favor of a cult based on purity and fire. Spiritual strength no longer depended on bloody offerings, but on a direct relationship with Ahura Mazda, based on right speech and right thought. The Kavis priests, whose influence rested on the management of altars and the contributions of livestock, saw their social and economic status threatened. The reform attracted followers, notably modest members of the clan, for whom the end of sacrifices represented a financial relief. This worried the Kavis priests and clan leaders, who derived their legitimacy from maintaining the priests and the ritual system. Zarathustra thus risked making them lose their grip. Turanian's chiefs, described as Deva worshippers, joined the opposition. For them, the Devas had to be courted through bloody rituals. The idea of a single, benevolent god requiring a non-violent cult seemed foreign and destabilizing. The tensions took the form of ritual trials. The Kavis summoned Zarathustra to justify his rejection of sacrifices and threatened him with anathema. The refusal of traditional deities equaled heresy, which could lead to exclusion and violence. Later accounts report that he was driven out of his home. The exile, which also affected his family and disciples, meant the abandonment of lands, cattle, and crops. This hostility, mixing Kavis priests and Turanian's chiefs, came from the direct attack the Zoroastrian dogma represented against the material basis of a system where sacrifices and tributes consolidated the power of the elites. This tribal opposition led to a climate of mistrust towards the young community. Zarathustra's message demanded the end of sacrifices and a new conception of justice. No longer the clan's might or the wealth of leaders, but the moral value of each individual, guided by Asha, truth, and order. The old priesthood saw it as a threat. If everyone could practice sincere devotion, why continue paying a heavy tribute in cattle? The challenge was as much spiritual as it was economic. The persecutors added material constraints to this religious refusal, sometimes forbidding Zarathustra's followers access to fairs and markets where vital cattle for these tribes were exchanged. The exiles sometimes had to seek asylum with less hostile leaders. The conflict crystallized around the issue of sacrifice. Abolishing offerings meant, according to the Kavas, provoking droughts, diseases, and defeats. They wielded the fear of divine punishment and the Daivas to maintain their power. These trials left a lasting mark on the Zoroastrian memory. Zarathustra's first persecution symbolizes the resistance of the past against a new religious vision. Although the tradition, transmitted orally, provides few details, later texts recall the opposition of the Kavis priests and Turanian's leaders, underlining the difficulty of the reform to establish itself in a society attached to sacrifices, tribal cohesion, and economic balance. Zarathustra's stay at King Vishtaspa's court marks the emergence of a first well-established Zoroastrian community. Sources place Vishtaspa's court in Kharasmia, on the banks of the Amudarya, in the north of present-day Afghanistan, or in Bactria, which stretched from the Oxus Basin to the foothills of the Hindu Kush. The location remains debated, but it is certain that this king ruled over a central kingdom, connected to caravanning routes for trade in metals, spices, and horses. In this context, Zarathustra's teachings disrupted tribal customs established for generations. This displacement was undoubtedly motivated by the hostility of priests and clan leaders attached to the Daivas, deities deemed harmful by the prophet. Rejecting bloody sacrifice, he was forced to leave his territory under threat of death. He found refuge at the court of Vishtaspa, a ruler portrayed as curious but cautious about new religious doctrines. His court, open to debate, allowed Zarathustra to present his message. The reception was difficult. Rival priests, magi or karpans, feared the influence of a doctrine centered on Ahura Mazda, a sovereign and omniscient deity, breaking away from their polytheistic cults. Accused of impiety, Zarathustra had to face a doctrinal debate in the presence of Vishtaspa and his court, referred to in Gatha Yasna 49, and sometimes called the Account of the 22 Questions. The exact content of these questions remains debated, but they concern the place of the ancient deities, the origin of evil, and the proofs of the prophet's contact with Ahura Mazda. In his responses, Zarathustra emphasized Asha, truth and order, as well as free will allowing man, through right thought, word and deed, to collaborate in the divine work against falsehood, the Druj. Vishtaspa played the role of arbiter, assisted by advisors attentive to the political consequences of such a reform. Changing cults risked provoking tensions or civil wars, as the nobility and the army often supported the bloody rituals of the ancient priests. The stakes went beyond doctrine. Royal power relied on control of ceremonies and offerings. Zarathustra insisted on the social and moral utility of his message, claiming that Ahura Mazda guaranteed stability and order for the kingdom. Late traditions recount the baptism of Zarathustra and King Vishtaspa in the Daitya River in Bactria. Water, a symbol of purification, and a realm of a holy entity protected by Ahura Mazda, represented for Zarathustra the public commitment to follow the truth. Vishtaspa, surrounded by his court, proclaimed his adherence to the doctrine, abandoned the rites contrary to Asha, and blessed his army, now the army of Asha, tasked with defending the just law against the Turanians, proponents of chaos and the Daiva. The royal conversion allowed the formation of a first Zoroastrian community. Zarathustra appointed a core group of priests, the Athravans, tied to the sacred fire, Athra in Avestan. Charged with maintaining the consecrated flame, a symbol of Ahura Mazda, they made fire the center of the cult, a guarantor of ritual purity and place of prayer. The reform was institutionalized through a calendar of festivals, including 6 Gahambars, seasonal ceremonies recalling the stages of creation. Under royal authority, they gathered the population, strengthened social cohesion, and spread the ethical principles of the prophet. The rallying was not without resistance. Several lords remained attached to the ancient cults. With the support of Vishtaspa, the Athruvans preached in the provinces and consolidated the reform. The rivalries focused on the Turanians, peoples beyond the Oxus who remained loyal to the Daiva. The conflict opposed the royal army and Turanian warriors in an alternation of skirmishes, truces, and alliances. The Gathas refer to these adversaries as proponents of violence and disobedience. Zarathustra strengthened the cohesion of the first Zoroastrian community through a liturgy centered on sacred mantras and purity. The Gathas, hymns attributed to the prophet, conveyed the doctrine, transmitted moral values, and served as the basis for daily rituals around the fire and offerings. At Vishtaspa's court, these chants became the core of collective ceremonies, sometimes sung by Zarathustra himself. The king's baptism in the Daitya River symbolized the new birth of the kingdom placed under Ahura Mazda's protection. This gesture legitimized Vishtaspa, presented as a pious and just ruler. He attempted to reign with order, Asha, through administrative reforms, fighting corruption, and increased support for the fire cult. The Athruvans, priests, and religious advisors participated in major political decisions, ensured the sanctity of oaths, and watched over the moral conduct of the faithful. Under Vishtaspa, the first fire temples appeared, a major innovation compared to domestic hearths and outdoor sanctuaries. These fixed locations allowed the emergence of a stable clergy and an organized hierarchy. The king ensured their maintenance and supply of fuel, thus affirming the imperial role of the ritual flame. The alliance between Zarathustra and Vishtaspa also had a social impact. The principles of truth and justice valued loyalty, commercial sincerity, and compassion towards the humble. Traditions report that the king reduced certain taxes and favored agrarian reforms. The Gahambars, collective festivals marked by ritual meals, reinforced solidarity among the court, warriors, priests, and peasants, giving the Zoroastrian doctrine a lasting foundation. Despite everything, pockets of resistance remained. The Karpans and the mages tied to the ancient deities still influenced certain aristocratic circles. Rumors of conspiracy persisted, forcing Zarathustra to justify his visions. Vishtaspa's support was decisive. Impressed by the coherence of his doctrine, he imprisoned opponents. This royal conversion provided an institutional framework for Zoroastrianism, but also involved the use of coercion. The adoption of Zoroastrianism as the court religion paved the way for the formalization of the rituals linked to the Gahambars, annual festivals celebrating the creation of the sky, water, earth, plants, animals, and humanity. They recalled the benevolence of Ahura Mazda and the struggle against lies. The Athruvans prepared consecrated food and drinks, demanded ritual purity from the participants, and also played a diplomatic role by gathering nobles and officers around the king. As Vishtaspa strengthened his power, the Zoroastrian community expanded by persuasion or by force. The tales glorify his firmness against the Turanians, formidable adversaries. The military conflict was doubled with a religious confrontation between the cult of Ahura Mazda and the ancient deities. The bards composed hymns exalting victorious truth, while the Athruvans accompanied the army, bringing prayers and offerings to inspire courage and discipline. Once consolidated, the community organized the transmission of rites and doctrines in priestly colleges where the recitation of the Gathas and auxiliary prayers was taught. Some disciples specialized in memorization, ensuring the perpetuity of the sacred texts before Avestan writing was used. The Athrivans protected this corpus, aware that its unaltered preservation was at the heart of the faith, now supported by royal power. Zarathustra's success with Vishtaspa can be explained by converging factors. The king saw in this monotheistic doctrine a means to consolidate his authority over rebellious nobles and unify his territory under a strong moral law. Zarathustra benefited from the prestige of a court capable of spreading his precepts. The local populations, charmed by a message of justice and the figure of a wise and benevolent single god, also rediscovered ancestral Iranian components like the veneration of fire, the natural cycle, and protective spirits. This convergence led to the first institutionalization of Zoroastrianism, now supported by a social, military, and cultural organization. The tale of the 22 questions became a founding myth, asserting Zarathustra's spiritual and intellectual superiority over the ancient priests and the victory of Asha, the truth. The Gahambars festivals, the fires kept perpetually lit, and the army of Asha attest to the birth of a cult recognized at the top of the state. Despite resistance, Vishtaspa's support served as a political shield, allowing Zoroastrianism to develop and prepare its partial adoption by future Iranian empires. Zarathustra remained at the center, guiding the community and structuring the liturgy. According to some testimonies, he traveled in the provinces, setting up hearths of fire and appointing new Athrivans as the number of converts grew. Thus, fire priests settled in Bactria, Sogdiana, Margiana, and neighboring regions. The localities loyal to Vishtaspa more easily adopted the Gathas as the official liturgical chant. If tribal opposition persisted, a balance was achieved through court diplomacy. Some reluctant leaders accepted partial conversions while keeping certain ancient rites. This syncretism offered Zoroastrianism the time to establish itself. The first community developed through compromise under royal authority that diffused crises. The Gahambars became the public expression of the Zoroastrian culture, providing a communal identity around the fire. With Vishtaspa, the path of Asha imposed itself as a moral ideal and a framework for daily life. Later texts report that the alliance between Zarathustra and King Vishtaspa allowed several victories over the Turanians, reinforcing the legitimacy of the reform. The converted king was presented as protected by Ahura Mazda, a title later adopted by Achaemenid and Sassanid rulers. These principles established at Vishtaspa's court laid the foundations of a religion destined to endure and adapt to the geopolitical upheavals of the following centuries. The Gathas, considered the oldest part of the Zoroastrian corpus, consist of 17 hymns attributed to Zarathustra. Sung or recited during ceremonies around the sacred fire, they present the earliest formulations of ethical dualism, honoring truth, Asha, and rejecting falsehood, Daryuj. They also introduce theological concepts surrounding Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of Zoroastrianism. The Gathic language, more archaic than the Old Avestan found in the Yasna and other prayers, is characterized by an ancient vocabulary and a grammar closely related to Indo-Iranian roots. It constitutes a major philological testimony, revealing the evolution of phonetics, morphology, and sacred lexicon. Some words, which disappeared in the more recent parts of the Avesta, indicate chronological breaks and a long oral transmission before being committed to writing. This orality relied on a tri-strophic meter. Each hymn was divided into rhythmic segments to facilitate memorization and participation. Stanzas of 3, 5, or 7 lines distinguished introduction, invocation, and conclusion. Refrains and exclamations served as mnemonic markers, ensuring continuity of the message. The ancient fire, Atash ceremonies, involved several priests, a main cantor, others echoing, sometimes 2 alternating groups. This responsorial recitation promoted accuracy and dissemination of the hymns before their transcription. In some passages of the yasna incorporating the gathas, formulas like Yatha Ahu Vairyo are repeated to maintain rhythm and reinforce the sanctity of the ceremony. Recitation during sacrifices was a solemn moment. In the Zoroastrian tradition, the most symbolic offering, beyond the haoma libation, was the sacred word itself, the gathas, the heart of the homage to Ahura Mazda. The priest, dressed in white, stood facing the altar fire. Each segment of the hymn was accompanied by a gesture, a prayer, or an acclamation, linking word, flame, and the devotee's consciousness. The fire, seen as the link between the material and spiritual worlds, witnessed the pronounced commitments. The metrical organization ensured the ceremony's fluidity, the clarity of homage, and the ritual efficacy meant to repel evil. The reciting priests, called Athravans, underwent rigorous training in hierarchical colleges, led by a master of chant, Herbed or Mobed, depending on the times. Orality was not merely an exercise of memory. It demanded perfect pronunciation, observance of purity rules, and understanding of divine principles. Novices recited daily, learning intonation and rhythm, and sometimes faced public exams. Any error in meter or diction was immediately corrected, ensuring the integrity of the gathas. Zoroastrian theology associated this transmission with fravashis, protective spiritual entities linked to collective memory. Each individual had their fravashi, but those of ancestors were invoked during services to ensure the accuracy of recitations. Thus, reciting the gathas was a moral contract with history and the invisible world, disallowing any approximation. This oral tradition persisted for a long time. As in other ancient cultures, writing the divine word seemed risky. Writing could alter pronunciation or expose hymns to the uninitiated. As long as the priestly colleges ensured transmission, writing was not considered necessary. The gathas lived in the voices that carried them. The writing down began slowly under the Achaemenids between the 6th and 4th centuries before Christ, then became more defined under the Parthians between the 2nd century before Christ and the 3rd century CE. Material evidence from this period is rare, often destroyed or incomplete. Some royal inscriptions, especially at Persepolis, do not reproduce the gathas, but reflect a proximity to their theology. A turning point occurred under the Sassanids, from the 3rd to the 7th century CE. The rulers established a centralized religious hierarchy and undertook the gathering of scattered texts into a canonical Avesta. The gathas, attributed to Zarathustra, occupied a central place there. Sassanid scribes formalized the language, verified the authenticity of the formulas, and recorded every word in an adapted script, Avestan, created to transcribe phonetic peculiarities. The gathas were then integrated into the yasna, the main liturgical book of Zoroastrianism, used during daily rituals. They thus made the transition from pure orality to writing, while retaining their nature as sacred songs. Historical sources attribute a decisive role to several Sasanian religious dignitaries in the preservation and organization of the corpus. Kartir, an influential priest under the reigns of Shapur I and his successors, is believed to have gathered and sorted the fragments preserved in the fire temples. The codification was carried out by priestly councils, which were entrusted with different segments of the Gathas to verify pronunciation variants. These councils compared regional traditions and produced a structured text in the 4th or 5th century Anno Domini. The imperial impetus, in a state where Zoroastrianism had the status of a quasi-official religion, accelerated this process of standardization. The transition from oral to written form did not diminish the importance of psalmody and responsorial singing. Even after the textual fixation, services favored rhythmic recitation, while the Avesta manuscripts mainly served as canonical reference. Priests trained in Gathic declamation ensured the sacred tradition, and the faithful, often non-readers, absorbed the hymns through repeated listening during major ceremonies. The ritual acts, offerings, maintenance of the fire, sprinkling of consecrated water, were chanted according to the text, with attention paid to combining fluency of diction and doctrinal rigor. The preserved manuscripts reveal traces of recomposition, minor lexical variations, and subdivisions added for ease of reading. The scribes, while preserving the archaic language, sometimes adopted more recent forms for clarity. These adjustments did not alter the initial poetic substance. The internal coherence and recurring formulas testify to a concerted effort by priests, scribes, and chantmasters to transmit this heritage intact. Under the Sasanians, the Gathas remained at the heart of the great annual festivals, the Gahambars, and the Zoroastrian New Year ceremonies, Nowruz. They were attributed spiritual and cosmic power, directly linking them to Zarathustra. Their simple hearing protected against chaos, and their memorization was a meritorious act. The priestly schools imposed strict discipline in pronunciation, accuracy of tunes, and adherence to ritual rules. Scribes collated all local versions to check spelling and avoid any omission. Modern researchers consider that this coexistence of orality and writing ensured the preservation in the Gathas of not only a liturgical collection, but also a worldview, a religious philosophy, and a set of ethical ideals expressed in poetic language. They form a monument of ancient Iranian literature and a link between the proto-historic Indo-Iranian era and later theological developments in the Middle East. The dissemination of the Gathas by voice and then by writing illustrates the value placed on living memory and the importance of this oral heritage for spiritual cohesion. Transcribed in the Avesta, the hymns managed to survive through the centuries, despite the fall of the Sasanian Empire in the 7th century. The medieval copies, rare but precious, reveal the work of Mobeds and Herbads concerned with preserving a complete corpus. Today, the manuscripts preserved in Europe or among the Parsi of India testify to this founding effort. The sacred voice, transmitted orally for centuries, found refuge in the volumes of the Avesta. In the Yashtic tradition, associated with the Yashts of the Avesta, ritual and devotional texts transmitted orally. The disappearance of Zarathustra, also known as Zoroaster in Greek sources, is described dramatically. The Yashts mainly praise the Yazatas, but some passages evoke the death of the prophet. Zarathustra is said to have been killed during a religious service by a Karpan priest, representative of a rival cult linked to deities classified as devas. In Zoroastrian thought, the Karpans are officiants associated with the ancient, bloody sacrifices that Zarathustra denounced. This episode, Murder Within a Sanctuary, profoundly marked the Zoroastrian community. The conflict opposed the prophet to the priests loyal to sacrifices and the old tribal hierarchy. According to the Gathas, the earliest hymns of the Avesta, Zarathustra advocated the rejection of ritual violence, the sacred word, mantra, instead of magic incantations, and sincere prayer to Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity. This reform threatened the interests of priests and tribal chiefs who lived off offerings. Despite the support of King Vishtaspa, Zarathustra remained vulnerable. The Karpan priests, allied with Turanian groups from the other side of the Oxus, in Central Asia, remained hostile to his message. The attack took place amidst a climate of tension between the supporters of Asha, truth and order, and the defenders of the old cult. Sources emphasize that the prophet was struck down during a liturgy, symbolizing the irreconcilable opposition between reformed religion and archaic practices. After the prophet's death, the first generation of Zoroastrian followers had to sustain the doctrinal momentum and organize into a solid community. Among them stood out the Satya, or Kavi lineage, sometimes referred to as Kayanian, which continued Zarathustra's ideological fight on both political and religious fronts. The term Kavi refers to an ancient legendary dynasty mentioned in the Avesta, associated with charismatic kings or chiefs who supported the Zoroastrian reform. This lineage, connected to Zarathustra at Vishtaspa's court, was tasked with protecting and spreading his teachings by relying on the Athravan priests. Guardians of the sacred fire, these priests relayed the prophet's word and perpetuated bloodless rituals, marking a break from ancient practices. The conflict against the Turanians continued as Zarathustra became a spiritual figure. In tradition, the Turanians are notorious enemies of the Iranian people and of truth, Asha. Led by leaders like Afrasiab, a semi-legendary figure of epics, they opposed Iranian culture and remained loyal to the Daivas, and an ancestral cult rejected by Zarathustra. This hostility, both tribal and religious, fueled the Zoroastrian memory. Far from extinguishing the struggle, the prophet's disappearance reinforced his disciples' determination and gave their fight a heroic dimension. Avestan tradition and its later extensions also mention the myth of Zarathustra's preserved seed. It is said that his vital essence was miraculously preserved in the waters of Lake Kansava, sometimes called Kansoya or Lake Kans. In Iranian cosmology, water is a sacred element, symbolizing purity and the continuity of life. It thus becomes a guarantor of the prophet's spiritual posterity. According to this myth, at a time determined by a cosmic conjunction or a divine sign, 3 figures called Seoshins will be born from this seed. The Avestan term means one who brings benefit, or one who saves. Presented as eschatological redeemers, the Saoshins will appear successively to purify the world and finalize the victory of Asha, truth and order, over the Druj, corruption and chaos. The belief in this preserved seed expresses both the sacralization of Zarathustra and the hope for a cosmic renewal. It sustains the faith that humanity, despite trials, will reach an era of bliss, thanks to the prophet's spiritual legacy. According to some variants of the myth, it is in Lake Kansava that the chosen young woman will bathe to conceive, without human intermediary, one of the future Saoshins. The purity of the water, associated with Zarathustra's seed, guarantees the birth of an incorruptible savior. These eschatological promises, disseminated in cults and liturgies, announce the final victory against the Daivas, forces hostile to Ahura Mazda. The preserved seed thus becomes the sign that, despite the prophet's brutal death, the salvific hope remains intact. After Zarathustra's murder, the first generation of disciples needed to maintain an oral teaching and confront the hostility of the old priestly castes and external enemies. The Satsya Kavi lineage took the lead of the resistance. It rallied indecisive populations, strengthened ties with King Vishtaspa, whose conversion was a major turning point, and organized the fire sanctuaries, gathering points for the faithful. The Athravan priests gradually codified the liturgies to preserve the integrity of the revealed word. Some songs attributed to the prophet are then transmitted through collective memory. The death of the master encourages this practice. The mantras must be preserved without alteration. The Satya Kavi lineage ensures orthodoxy, protecting against additions or falsifications. Close disciples, sometimes linked by family ties, become heroic figures and poles of authority capable of organizing clandestine gatherings if necessary. The struggle against the Turanians, as later recounted, goes beyond the military dimension. It reinforces Zoroastrian identity. The spiritual heirs of Zarathustra present themselves as defenders of the true faith against Turanian polytheistic traditions. The Karpan priests, accused of participating in the prophet's murder, embody in the collective memory a corrupt past attached to the old sacrifices rejected by the reform. According to researchers, after the prophet's death, the disciples could have dispersed to Bactria, Margiana, or other eastern Iranian principalities while maintaining their ties through travels and common rituals. Hostile magi attempted to slow the diffusion through rumors and accusations of heresy. However, the protection of King Vishtaspa and the support of later dynasties ensured the rooting of Zoroastrianism. The Satsya Kavi lineage, the guarantor of doctrinal lineage, structured the oral transmission of the Avesta and spread the belief in the three Saoshyants. The belief in a future redeemer from a preserved seed found particular resonance among the first generations. The narratives highlighted the sacredness of Lake Kansava, sometimes located in a high valley, sometimes near the great rivers of Central Asia, but always described as miraculous and a guarantor of the spiritual lineage of Zarathustra. Zoroastrian texts, written shortly before the Sassanid period, report that followers made symbolic pilgrimages to sacred lakes or rivers to be spiritually reborn and renew their commitment to Ahura Mazda and the prophet's doctrine. The persistence of these practices illustrates the central importance given to Zarathustra's legacy. The murder of Zarathustra by a Karpan priest, according to the Yash tradition, marked a decisive turning point. Deprived of their prophet, the group of disciples organized around carefully transmitted texts and rituals. The Satya Kavi lineage, linked to Vishtaspa's court, perpetuated his work, while the followers maintained the hope of a future advent, that of the Saoshyants, tasked with completing the victory of truth. The belief in a seed protected at the bottom of a sacred lake symbolized this spiritual continuity. The first generations consolidated their doctrine and their cult: fire worship, psalm recitation, and memorization of the Gathas. Singing these hymns was equivalent to prolonging Zarathustra's voice and preparing for the arrival of the saviors. The world was perceived as a metaphysical battlefield where the prophet's disappearance reinforced the necessity of an unshakable faith in just order, Asha, against chaos, Druj. The violent death of Zarathustra, caused by a representative of the old cult, was understood as a warning. Any religious change comes with conflicts. But the notion of Saoshyant offered a driving force of hope. The coming savior was not only the spiritual successor of the prophet, he heralded a cosmic resolution. The myth of the seed gave this continuity a mystical dimension and oriented faith toward a future where good would triumph definitively. The memory of Zarathustra's murder reinforces his image as a hero and founding martyr. The early communities identify as the continuators of a spiritual leader who fell for defending Asha. The rhetoric of sacrifice runs through the accounts, and the priests, called Magi, Athravans, or Herbads, strive to preserve the mantras, distinguishing the prophet's teaching from what was added later. They remind followers that, despite the master's disappearance, his essence remains alive in the community and in the hope of a spiritual posterity. The Satya Kavi lineage prolongs the struggle against the Turanians, presents itself as the guardian of teachings, and values Lake Kansava as the cradle of the three Saoshyants. Their authority guarantees the orthodoxy of the transmitted narratives. In certain ceremonies, the divine promise of a new Redeemer is recited to strengthen the faith and remind that the struggle between good and evil will find its end with the arrival of the Liberator. Thus, the memory of martyrdom, legitimate transmission, and the expectation of a savior unite to give coherence to Zoroastrianism, a religion of revelation, ensuring continuity between the prophet, community organization, and eschatological hope. In the early times, believers intensified their prayers to Ahura Mazda and the Amesha Spenta. Services became commemorations, recounting the ultimate battle of Zarathustra against the murderous Karpan, and each lit flame affirming his presence. The recitation of the Gathas was codified, and the idea imposed itself that tradition must one day be recorded in writing. It is in this context that the myth of the preserved seed takes root. One can kill the man, but not extinguish the light he revealed. This seed, conceived as an intangible and real part of the prophet, ensures the coming of the three Saoshyants, future sons of Zarathustra, each tasked with restoring order in critical periods. The pain of loss then becomes a driving force. The Satya Kavi lineage, supported by political leaders and believers scattered across the Iranian plateau, pursues the cause of Asha. Nourished by faith in the preserved seed, the first generation, marked by persecution, forges the foundations of an imperishable religion, destined to grow stronger and spread. At the beginning of the first millennium before Christ, the northwest of Iran and part of the Iranian plateau were occupied by various Indo-Iranian groups, including the Medes, organized into clans and principalities. Mentioned by Assyrian sources since the 9th century before Christ, they did not yet form a unified empire but developed their own identity. Under the authority of tribal leaders and local dynasties, they forged alliances and built a more coherent political organization. Their religion, still diverse, combined beliefs linked to natural forces, solar cults, and a pre-Iranian pantheon. Open-air sanctuaries hosted rituals centered on fire and animal sacrifices. The teachings attributed to Zarathustra were already circulating, but in a partial and doctrinally heterogeneous manner. In this context appears the term magoi, known by the Greeks, which likely designates the Median priestly order. Herodotus, in the 5th century before Christ, describes the Magi as a tribe dedicated to religious services and expert in the art of sacrifices. The word magush in Old Persian evokes spiritual power and esoteric knowledge. The Magoi practiced complex rituals mixing hymns, sacred fires, and astrological observation. Their prestige also rested upon the adaptation of Vedic or Proto-Zoroastrian formulas to their culture. The influence of Zarathustra remains uncertain, but certain rituals, like the Hyoma cult, seem reinterpreted around notions of purity and the fight against Druj, the forces of deceit. In the 7th century before Christ, the Medes grew stronger. Leaders like Diocles and Phraortes attempted to federate tribes against the Assyrians. Cyaxares, king between 625 and 585. Before Christ, consolidated this power and founded a kingdom sometimes called the Median Empire, although its unity remained fragile. The Magoi played a central role there. They officiated in the sanctuaries, interpreted omens, and legitimized the sovereign. At court, the idea of a supreme god, Ahura Mazda, symbol of order and wisdom, gradually spread without erasing the old cults. Fragmentary inscriptions indicate that the opposition between cosmic order and chaos, an essential concept of Zoroastrianism, was already being discussed. When Median power collapsed before Cyrus II, known as Cyrus the Great, around 550 before Christ the Achaemenid Persian Empire extended from Central Asia to Anatolia. Cyrus, from the Achaemenid dynasty, claimed both Persian and Median heritage. He retained certain administrative structures and integrated Median priests, including the Magoi, into the religious and political apparatus. These magi sanctified the king's power while being influenced by Zoroastrian teachings. Fire rituals, once intermittent among the Medes, became central at the Achaemenid court. The prestige of the priests increased, reinforcing the spread of ideas like respect for purity, the importance of truth, asha, and the disapproval of deceit. Liturgical reforms began under Cyrus and continued under Darius Thusthurs, who reigned from 522 to 486 before Christ. The documentation is sparse, but hints suggest that the abolition of human sacrifices was a significant measure during this period. The sacred fire, a symbol of purification and a manifestation of Ahura Mazda, gained a major place in ceremonies. According to the Greek historian Xenophon, the king regularly offered libations at sunrise before a fire maintained day and night by priests. These priests imposed strict prohibitions to avoid any defilement. The fire became a symbol of the state, associated with the monarchy and royal legitimacy. This cult was integrated with older deities as part of a syncretic policy. Mithra, the god of light and oaths, was presented as the protector of contracts and guarantor of justice, aligning him with Asha. Anahita, the goddess of waters and fertility, retained her sanctuaries and role related to rivers and springs, in keeping with the Zoroastrian emphasis on the purity of elements, especially water. The Achaemenid Persians did not seek to abolish these cults, but to incorporate them into the veneration of Ahura Mazda. The fire cult gradually took on a public and administrative dimension. Official fires were maintained in strategic cities, overseen by a clergy from the Median, Magoi, and Persian priests. Celebrations at the equinoxes and solstices brought together elites, reaffirmed the unity of the kingdom, and proclaimed the sovereign's legitimacy. Fires lit on heights, especially in Persis, became visible landmarks day and night, symbolizing royal vigilance and the victory of order over chaos. Hymns in Old Persian, or inspired by Avestan texts, finally recall the persistent influence of Zarathustra's writings. The reforms related to the gradual adoption of Zoroastrianism at the Achaemenid court strengthened control over cults. The priests of the fire temples, from hereditary families, ensured stability and ritual continuity. In some provinces, populations remained attached to older forms of piety. The central power tolerated this diversity as long as it adhered to major principles: the cleanliness of sanctuaries, the absence of human sacrifices, and the recognition of Ahura Mazda as the supreme deity. This tolerance increased the loyalty of the subjects and oriented the empire towards a more philosophical religiosity. Offerings of wine and incense fumigations replaced bloody sacrifices, valuing prayers and fragrant smoke. Mithra, an ancient cult in Bactria and Margiana, was associated with the sun, justice, and the protection of the righteous. In the Avesta, he is described as the Lord of vast pastures, guaranteeing the loyalty of warriors and truth. His role aligned with the imperial ideology which made the king a servant of truth under Ahura Mazda. Anahita, meanwhile, sometimes received sumptuous temples, as under Artaxerxes II. As the goddess of fertility, agricultural prosperity, and the purity of waters, she was richly adorned, holding a vessel of sacred water and honored with fragrant offerings. The doctrinal dissemination adapted to populations who did not understand Old Persian or Avestan. The Magi preached in multiple languages the belief in a supreme god assisted by benevolent beings. This transmission occurred at court but also in villages, thanks to itinerant priests performing protective rites, nuptial blessings, or seasonal festivals. Local influences mingled with this. In some border areas, shamanic rituals persisted, and ancient deities continued to be venerated, provided they were assimilated to the benevolent spirits of the Persian tradition. Under the reign of Darius I and his successors, the Achaemenid Empire extended to Egypt and the Indus Valley. The authorities developed a centralized administration based on satrapies. The court religion, inspired by Zoroastrianism, became a supreme reference. The sovereign presented himself as chosen by Ahura Mazda, protector of justice and truth. The bas-reliefs of Persepolis and Behistun depict Darius under the guard of a figure or winged disc, often identified as the Fair-Bahar, a symbol of celestial protection. Even without an explicit formulation of good-evil dualism, the emperor appears as invested with a mission to maintain order in the face of chaos and falsehood. The spread of this religion among the Medes and Persians remains partial. Some regions retain their local traditions. The Magi priests value Ahura Mazda and the Asha, but also perpetuate ancient heritages. Greek authors like Plutarch emphasize their magical dimension, describing them as sorcerers or astrologers. In reality, their role focuses on the purity of the elements and fire rites, with astronomy mainly used to determine festivals or support political and military decisions. Under Darius the Fair, human sacrifices disappear, marking a religious turning point. Fire becomes a ritual, identity, and political symbol, legitimizing royal authority in the name of divine truth. Ancient deities like Mithra and Anahita find a place in this new framework, allowing the unification of old beliefs and imperial cult. The Magi adapt as mediators between polytheism and faith in Ahura Mazda. Tolerant of local cults, the Achaemenid Empire promotes this religious syncretism, which will have a lasting influence on subsequent Iranian dynasties, all required to maintain a sacred fire and proclaim their fidelity to the supreme god. In the second half of the 6th century before Christ, the Achaemenid Empire emerges under the leadership of Cyrus II, known as Cyrus the Great, king from 559 to 530 before Christ. He defeats the Medes and unifies a vast territory, from Central Asia to Asia Minor, then to Eastern Anatolia and the gates of Babylonia. The place of Zoroastrianism under Cyrus remains debated. The inscriptions mainly mention a supreme god, later identified as Ahura Mazda. This name is clearly asserted under Darius I, king from 522 to 486 before Christ, and his successors. Official texts present Ahura Mazda as the source of sovereignty and guarantor of royal legitimacy, without exposing a dualistic discourse. The major example is the Behistun inscription, commissioned by Darius shortly after his accession to the throne. Engraved in Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian, it recounts his victories over usurpers and attributes his power to Ahura Mazda, the greatest of the gods. This text, pure political propaganda, emphasizes the king's divine protection, but ignores the moral theology of the Gathas. Under Darius, Xerxes III, 486-465, and Artaxerxes III, 465-424, Ahura Mazda remains the tutelary deity, source of prosperity. Xerxes had several inscriptions engraved at Persepolis and Nakshi Rostam, glorifying the deity. They do not yet mention the struggle between Asha, order, and Druj, lie, but affirm imperial unity around a protector god of the King of Kings. This discourse must be placed in the context of a multi-ethnic empire encompassing Persians, Medes, Babylonians, Egyptians, Lydians, Phoenicians, Jews, and Greeks of Asia Minor. Imperial management relies on religious tolerance. Each satrapy keeps its cults, while the power promotes an imperial cult around the king and Ahura Mazda. The administrative tablets of Persepolis, especially the fortification tablets, reveal the use of a Zoroastrian-inspired calendar for dating deliveries of cereals, livestock, and wine. The months bear names that will become typical of the Avestan tradition. These archives also mention the maintenance of fire temples through distributions of barley and purification rituals ordered by the central power. The sacred fire thus appears as an imperial symbol, without reflecting a uniform orthodoxy. Practices varied according to the regions. In Egypt, conquered by Cambyses II, son of Cyrus, around 525 before Christ, the local cult was tolerated. The Achaemenid pharaohs, while mentioning Ahura Mazda in their Persian inscriptions, represented themselves as legitimate rulers according to Egyptian tradition, dressed in pharaonic costume and presenting themselves as sons of the gods. Xerxes and his successors maintained this dual stance. In the western satrapies and in Babylonia, native temples and priests persisted, financed by funds provided for their maintenance. The empire formalized the veneration of Ahura Mazda, but without imposing an exclusive cult. In the Levant, this tolerance allowed the reconstruction of the Temple of Jerusalem under Darius I, attested in the Book of Ezra. Herodotus, born around 484 and died around 425 before Christ, notes that the Persians do not erect divine statues. They venerate the sun, the moon, water, and fire, and pay homage to the sky in the open air. His remarks, although limited, reflect the persistence of aniconic rituals and a fire cult centered on a supreme god. This policy included maintaining local sanctuaries as long as they remained loyal to the king. Exceptions existed. Xerxes damaged the Asagil temple in Babylon after a revolt in 482 before Christ, and Egyptian uprisings were suppressed following the death of Darius. But overall, the Achaemenid bureaucracy was flexible. Tax exemptions for prestigious sanctuaries, funded restorations, management entrusted to notables integrated into the administration. The role of Zoroastrian priests at the court remains uncertain. Greek sources refer to magi, describing Medes or Persian priests linked to fire and various rites. Some may have been Zoroastrians, but official acts limit references to Ahura Mazda without mentioning a unified canonical corpus. The magi appear as advisors, astrologers, and officiants of sacrifices, but their exact function remains unclear. Finally, major festivals were based on the Persian calendar, such as Nowruz, the new year celebrated at the spring equinox. The Persepolis archives attest to special distributions of rations, clothing gifts, and presents during seasonal festivities. These gatherings around ritual fires reinforce the unity of the Iranian populations while respecting the diversity of the conquered regions. Archaeological evidence, statues, and reliefs demonstrate that the Achaemenid court placed great importance on the purity of water and fire. In Persepolis, the king is often depicted with incense burners or braziers, symbols of purification and protection. In Susa and Ecbatana, large basins of fresh water were used for lustration ceremonies. These rites associated the sovereign with Ahura Mazda and affirmed his role in preserving Asha, the Zoroastrian concept linking truth and cosmic order. The duality of good and evil, although central in Zoroastrianism, does not appear directly. Some believe that this opposition was not yet fully formulated at the time, while others suggest that the kings avoided highlighting a moral conflict that could divide an empire founded on the coexistence of beliefs. This strategy went hand in hand with a policy of religious tolerance. The monarchs allowed the continuance of Mesopotamian, Egyptian, or Anatolian cults, except in cases of revolts. Ahura Mazda was still presented as the source of royal power. The Persians in Medes saw this as an extension of the tradition of Zarathustra, while the Babylonians continued to honor Marduk. In Asia Minor, the Greeks of the Ionian cities in Lydia and Caria had to recognize the authority of the great king and pay tribute without any religious ideology being imposed on them. Zoroastrianism was mainly transmitted culturally through Persian settlers and soldiers. A few Iranian sanctuaries appeared, but Greek cults dominated. In Egypt, despite the presence of Persian administration and settlers, the traditional cult largely persisted. Priests kept their functions as long as they respected royal authority. Zoroastrianism, perceptible in royal inscriptions invoking Ahura Mazda in Old Persian or Elamite, was not imposed. Egyptian temples remained active, and Persian spiritual influence was mainly limited to the elites and the Iranian diaspora. Thus, speaking of a state Zoroastrianism under the Achaemenids requires nuance. The inscriptions of Darius I and Xerxes clearly show an imperial cult to Ahura Mazda, centered on fire, an Iranian calendar, and a priestly hierarchy. But in practice, the empire allowed each people to honor their gods, maintaining political unity without imposing a singular religion. The diffusion of Persian identity spread in Asia Minor thanks to local elites gradually Persianizing by wearing Persian clothing, using Aramaic as an administrative language, and constructing monumental tombs inspired by Iranian models. Persian settlers and soldiers sometimes maintained a sacred fire and honored Ahura Mazda, creating nurseries of Iranian beliefs within the diasporas, sometimes mixed with Greek or Anatolian cults. In Egypt, the influence remained more limited. Persian kings superficially adopted the divine pharaonic titulary, but were perceived as foreigners. At Elephantine, Persian garrisons mingled with Jewish and Egyptian populations under the authority of a satrap. The Elephantine papyri testify to a varied religious coexistence, marked by Semitic, Greek, and Egyptian deities, with no massive spread of Zoroastrian faith. No organized proselytism is attested. Within the Iranian diaspora, the cultural unity around Ahura Mazda, the purifying fire, and a specific calendar persists, but remains confined to the military, the court, and the administration. Some officials transmit their funerary rites and cosmological conceptions, while others adapt to local traditions. Royal inscriptions do not mention internal tensions and claim harmony orchestrated from the center, with Ahura Mazda primarily embodying dynastic legitimacy. The Achaemenid period thus constitutes a major milestone for Iranian religion without establishing a Zoroastrian state. The kings proclaim Ahura Mazda as the god of the dynasty and protect the fire sanctuaries, but religious tolerance prevails. The empire fosters a common ideological foundation centered on this creator god and divine favor, without imposing Zoroastrian dogmas on all populations, which will only be codified later. In the 4th century before Christ, the Achaemenid Empire collapses in the face of the armies of Alexander the Great, king of Macedonia, campaigning against the Persians. Within a few years, the power dominated by Darius III is absorbed into the vast Macedonian domain, from Greece to the borders of India. At the death of Alexander in 323 before Christ, his generals divide the heritage, inaugurating the Hellenistic period. The Near East, Egypt, Asia Minor, and other Greek regions then experience a cultural dynamic made of borrowings and local reappropriations. In this context, Zoroastrian beliefs come into contact with Greek philosophical and religious tradition. Philosophers, astrologers, and historians take an interest in the Persian formulations of the sacred, while the Seleucid court sometimes favors the fusion of cults. The memory of Alexander, deified by some successors, inspires stories and legends about warrior kings. Zoroastrianism then undergoes the influence of Greek metaphysical speculations, Chaldean magic, and new forms of Mediterranean astrology. Greeks sometimes assimilate Zarathustra to a wise or magician figure. Some authors, unfamiliar with Iranian history, associate his name with esoteric practices, oracles, or hermetic traditions. This tendency is expressed in the idea of a Hermes Zoroaster, present in some Gnostic or Neoplatonic writings. The rapprochement between Hermes, the messenger of the gods and patron of esoteric sciences, and Zarathustra, founder of a major Eastern religion, symbolizes the fascination exerted by the priests of Iran. Since classical Greece, the word mage refers to Persian priests, renowned for their mastery of invisible forces. This reputation confounds the prophetic wisdom of the Gathas with Babylonian astrology and the deciphering of celestial signs. In Greek courts, notably at Pergamon and Antioch, Oriental knowledge is invoked to legitimize divinatory practices, examination of stars, study of dreams, or making talismans. Supposed Zoroastrian texts then appear in Greek. The Chaldean oracles, poetic fragments presented as a divine revelation, contain Oriental references tinged with Platonism and mysticism. Some passages evoke the struggle of good and evil, adapted to the Neoplatonist taste for spiritual duality. Scholars see in it a syncretism, merging Iranian dualism and Greek cosmology. Other treatises, like the Peri-Archon, on principles, seek to establish a doctrine of creation and a hierarchy of divine entities, while claiming a Zoroastrian tradition. Zarathustra is magnified as the master of spirits and the revealer of an ancestral knowledge preceding Greek civilization. Hellenistic domination gradually recedes under the influence of Iranian rebellions. From the second half of the 3rd century before Christ, Arsaces rises against the Seleucids in eastern Iran and founds the Parthian dynasty known as Arsacid. This becomes a new rival empire to the Greco-Syrian power. The Parthian kings, while adopting some Hellenistic traits in art, coinage, or urban organization, promote the emergence of an Iranian identity, supported by a recomposition of the priestly elites and the enhancement of local religious traditions. Zoroastrianism is not yet centralized as under the Sassanids, but the Parthians value certain sanctuaries, notably the royal fire of Adur-Burzan-Mehr in Khorasan, linked to the mythical king Vishtaspa, protector of Zarathustra. This sacred hearth, closely associated with the court, becomes a pillar of Arsacid propaganda. In parallel, the cult of Mithra is experiencing a boom. An Iranian deity protector of oaths, it is adopted by the Parthian army and merges with Greek elements, heroic representations, Phrygian cap, astrological symbols. This syncretism, useful for integrating diverse populations, especially appeals to the warrior elite and spreads in border regions like Mesopotamia and Cappadocia. The Iranian priests, mages, mobeds, maintain the Zoroastrian tradition, sometimes divided between conservatives and proponents of syncretism. The dualistic doctrines, Asha against Druj, continue to structure morality, especially in the countryside. The court, concerned with stability, favors coexistence between Iranian practices, Greek influences, and Mesopotamian contributions, at the risk of criticism from traditionalist circles. Finally, the Parthians play a role as intermediaries in scholarly exchanges. Heirs of the Babylonian astronomical knowledge and Greek speculations, Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, they encourage study centers where Eastern scholars and Hellenized savants meet. Zoroastrian priests thus associate the Iranian concept of Asha with the geocentric view of the world. This heritage consolidates the place of astrology in later Zoroastrianism, without the stars becoming objects of worship. Intellectually, the Parthian period reflects the reality of the empire in texts in the Parthian language and in the Avestan oral tradition. Priests preserve and transmit doctrinal fragments, enriched with commentaries adapted to the context. Greek influences appear in the use of a philosophical vocabulary and in allegories of light and darkness. Mystical currents like Orphism and Pythagoreanism offer parallels with Zoroastrian eschatology, purification of the soul, and promise of immortality. This conjunction favors conceptual rapprochements between Hellenic and Iranian traditions. Later, the Neoplatonist tradition mobilizes the figure of Zoroaster to justify discourses on the transmigration of the soul or theurgical rituals, although these concepts are absent from the primitive Avesta. The Parthian rulers, while consolidating their territories, encouraged the construction of sumptuous sanctuaries intended to rival Greek temples. Ionic or Corinthian columns stand alongside Iranian symbols, like the winged disc or the image of fire. Remains reveal ritual banquets and the consumption of sacred drinks, similar to Zoroastrian haoma or Greek libations. This aesthetic and cultural synthesis illustrates the flexibility of the empire, capable of absorbing various cultural traits without standardizing its realm. Cosmopolitanism favors hybridizations, such as the assimilation of Anahita to Artemis or Aphrodite. However, some centers defend a purer Zoroastrianism, especially in peripheral areas, less exposed to Hellenistic influences. Tribal chiefs cultivate an Iranian identity centered on Ahura Mazda and the worship of the sacred fire, Atash. They strictly maintain purity rules, such as prohibiting the pollution of water and earth during funerals. These local practices sometimes complicate the religious diplomacy of the Arsacids, who prefer to leave a margin of autonomy to regional sanctuaries while controlling influential priests through titles and funding. The fascination for Persian mages permeates late Greek tradition. Diodorus of Sicily and Plutarch mention encounters, real or imagined, between Greek philosophers and Iranian priests. Zarathustra becomes a tutelary figure, associated with ceremonial magic, hermeticism, and the secrets of nature. Zoroastrian funeral rites, with the exposure of bodies on dokmas, towers of silence, intrigue Greek authors who see in them a special relationship with the purity of the earth. This quest for Eastern wisdom is reflected in pseudo-Zoroastrian texts in Greek, focused on the genesis of the world and the celestial order. The Chaldean oracles distinguish pure celestial fire and the corruptible sublunar world, paralleling the Zoroastrian opposition between Asha, order and truth, and Druj, lies and chaos. The Peri-Archon presents an Iranian master transmitting metaphysical knowledge to a Greek disciple. These writings transform Zarathustra into a Platonic or Pythagorean thinker, abandoning concrete ritual practices, fire worship, gaz, for philosophical speculations. The sacred fire becomes a symbol of the soul or divine intellect. In parallel, the Parthian power seeks to strengthen its legitimacy by favoring the presence of Greek contingents in major cities. Merchants, navigators, and adventurers from Greece or the Levant circulate more freely, spreading beliefs and cultic practices. Mithraism then takes on a cosmopolitan dimension. Mithra is seen both as an Iranian god and as a sun god, assimilated with Helios or Apollo. Parthian coins bear witness to this, representing Greco-Eastern deities accompanied by Greek or Aramaic inscriptions. This usage serves both the diffusion of royal ideology and religious acculturation. The fire temples, such as Adur Burzan Mer, remain, however, identity markers. This sanctuary, linked to Zoroastrian-inspired oracles, was used to settle questions of succession or sacred law. The Parthian kings sought recognition there as protectors of the faith, anchoring their power in an Iranian continuity. Even within a Hellenized court, validation by the fire of Burzan Mer reminded them of their role as guarantors of the sacred law, the Asha. During this period, some of the Iranian priestly literature, hitherto oral, begins to be written in Parthian, Middle Persian, or in a mixture of Aramaic and Greek. The Magi call upon scribes to record and translate religious, ritual, and legendary texts. Although the originals have disappeared, archaeological evidence and later sources show that this scriptural effervescence prepared the Sasanian Zoroastrianism. The Parthians thus serve as a cultural springboard, while imposing a dialogue between Iranian traditions and foreign influences. This dynamic contributes to the contrasting perception of Zarathustra, a monotheistic prophet for some, an air mage of Chaldean secrets for others. In the 3rd century, the Sasanian Empire was born under Ardashir I, who reigned from 224 to 241 after overthrowing the Arsacid dynasty. From its inception, the Mazdean religion, the cult of Ahura Mazda, transmitted by Zarathustra, receives a privileged status. The religious dignitaries work to codify and centralize the still largely oral traditions to give Zoroastrianism a solid and official base. Two figures stand out, Kartir, or Kurdir, and Tansar, who contribute to the development of a unified version of the Avesta and the organization of a strict priestly hierarchy. In this context, the great Middle Persian chronicles, such as the Bundahishan, the Denkart, or the Wizidagiha-i Zadsparam, also appear. Meanwhile, the Sasanians persecute Manichaeans, Christians, and some Buddhists. Finally, religious architecture asserts itself through fire temples, Atash Behram, and towers of silence, Dakma, which durably mark the Iranian landscape. Ardashir the Firm, eager to unify his empire under a political and spiritual authority, relied on Tansar, an influential priest. He undertook to gather the Zoroastrian traditions then dispersed, heritage of the Achaemenid and Parthian era, where the Avesta had not been written down. With the king's approval, he confiscated the ritual texts kept by various priestly circles, eliminated inconsistencies, and laid the foundations of an official corpus, the embryo of the vulgar Avesta, a standardized version recited throughout the empire. A few decades later, Kartir, high priest under several reigns, amplified this work. His rock inscriptions at Naqsh Rajab and Naqsh Rustam present him as the architect of an imperial Zoroastrianism. He clarified the doctrine, reinforced the social order, and associated royal power with religious orthodoxy. But his project also involved the repression of minorities, Manichaeans followers of Mani in the 3rd century, Christians often assimilated to the Roman Empire, and to a lesser extent, Buddhist communities of Central Asia. Under Tansar and Kartir, the Avesta took a form divided into prayers, liturgical texts, prescriptions, and cosmogonic narratives. The recitation was done in late Avestan or Middle Persian. The clergy was organized into a strict hierarchy: the Mobed, supreme leader, the Herbed, in charge of teaching and rites, and the Magush, a broader term designating the priests. In parallel, several works in Middle Persian developed Sasanian theology. The Bundahishan, or original creation, describes the work of Ahura Mazda and the intrusion of Ahriman. The Denkart, religion's deed, forms an encyclopedia mixing commentary on the Avesta, morality, law, and mythological narratives. The Wizidagiha-i Zadsparam, attributed to the priest Zadsparam, takes the form of questions and answers on theology and discipline. These writings bear witness to intense intellectual activity and a desire to adapt Zoroastrian revelation to the realities of a multi-ethnic empire. Sassanid centralization is reflected by strong intervention in religious matters. As the Avesta is codified and the priestly hierarchy is organized, tolerance towards competing cults diminishes. Manichaeism, founded by Mani in the mid-3rd century, causes concern with its dualism rivaling Zoroastrianism. Under Bahram Tharfiz, who reigned from 273 to 276, Mani is arrested and executed in 276. The high priest Kartir claims in his inscriptions to have suppressed heresies. Christians also face restrictions, especially during periods of war against Rome and Byzantium. Under Shapur II, from 309 to 379, waves of persecution target the Church of the East, accused of Roman sympathies. Monasteries are closed, bishops executed, like Saint Simeon Bar Sabai. Buddhists, less present, are also affected, though their presence is primarily limited to Central Asia. Zoroastrianism is also asserted through sacred architecture. Fire, the pure symbol of Ahura Mazda, is honored in specialized temples. The most sacred is the Atash Behram, fire of victory, obtained by collecting and purifying several fires. Once consecrated, it becomes the soul of the sanctuary, maintained day and night by trained priests. The temples, built on heights or in protected places, house the flame in a closed chamber. The public can access it after ablutions and ritual garments to maintain purity. In the province of Fairs, majestic buildings sometimes host the emperor himself. During major festivals like Nowruz or Merrigan, these sanctuaries become the heart of collective life, and some kings erect temples to commemorate victories or dynastic events. Strictness extends to funerary rites. Any contamination of earth, air, water, or fire is prohibited. Burying or burning a corpse is therefore considered impure. The deceased are placed in a dakma, or tower of silence, a circular stone building constructed on a height. Exposed to the sun and birds, the bodies are quickly cleared of their flesh, ensuring natural purification without polluting the elements. The maintenance of these towers falls under religious authority. The use of dakmas becomes widespread under the Sassanids, linked to the strengthening of the priestly hierarchy. Mobeds ensure rules are respected, and burial is equated with a transgression, subject to sanctions. This illustrates the alliance of political power and clergy to impose a homogeneous Zoroastrianism. Monuments related to fire, like towers of silence, strongly mark the urban and rural landscapes of the Sasanian Empire. In the successive capitals, such as Ctesiphon in Mesopotamia or Bishapur in Fairs, a fire temple often occupies a central place at the heart of the royal palace or nearby. Its symbolic power demonstrates the court's adherence to Mazdean doctrine. Schools of priests, libraries, and study rooms dedicated to the Avesta's commentary complete the ensemble. Narratives describe processions where the sovereign, clad in royal attire, kneels before the fire, receives blessings, and reaffirms the union of the throne of Iran and the doctrine of Zarathustra. The king then appears as the guarantor of Asha, order, and truth, while priests keep the flame and rituals. The major annual festivals, like Nowruz in spring, or Tirgan in honor of Tishraya, the deity of rain, illustrate this centrality of fire. Secondary flames drawn from the main Atash Beharam are lit. The population gathers to pray, read the Avesta, and offer branches of wood or aromatic plants symbolizing purity. These gestures express the cosmic struggle between truth and deceit, and the anticipation of Ahura Mazda's final victory over Ahriman. Zoroastrian sanctuaries are not only places of worship, but also civic gathering places where imperial power reinforces its legitimacy. In the eastern cities of the empire, like Merv or Balkh, the fire temples coexist with other religious buildings, Buddhist or Hindu. However, the hierarchy established by Kartir, Tansar, and their successors ensures the supremacy of Zoroastrianism. Official inscriptions recall the glory of the kings in direct connection with Ahura Mazda, equating any other spiritual allegiance with defiance against the crown. Imperial officials, often trained in the doctrine, thus ensure cohesion between administration and clergy. This system extends to the countryside and large agricultural estates, where priests supervise village practices. Sources also mention internal rivalries within the clergy, with the title of Mobedan Mobed, Mobed of Mobeds, being highly coveted. The disputes concern the assignment of duties, the distribution of sacred revenues, or the priority in ceremonies. Kings arbitrate these conflicts according to their interests. Kartir, for example, rose due to his closeness with Hormizd I or Bahram Afirm, Bahram II, and Narse, but had to face rival clans. For the dynasty, the challenge was to preserve the apparent unity of the cult and avoid schisms that could weaken the empire. The official chronicles in Middle Persian conceal these tensions, insisting on the harmony between state and religion, while Greek or Armenian reports reveal occasional conflicts between high priests, which the sovereign had to temper to maintain religious peace. In the context of canonization and reform, the sacred texts undergo successive revisions to eliminate contradictions and deviations. This is called liturgical normalization. Late Avestan or Middle Persian dominate, while the oldest Gathic chants in archaic Avestan are preserved but accompanied by glosses and commentaries. Under Sasanian authority, the Avesta takes its canonical form and is transcribed in the 4th or 5th century, sometimes enriched with prescriptions for festivals and rites of passage. The oral tradition remains essential in ceremonies, but the written text becomes a guarantor of authenticity. The Denkart, a theological and philosophical compendium, then serves as a guide for the use and interpretation of the texts. This institutionalization reinforces the theocratic character of the Sasanian Empire. The sovereigns, presenting themselves as servants of Ahura Mazda, justify wars, political decisions, and taxation. The Avesta governs social life, ritual purity, observance of auspicious days, funeral rites. Secondary fire temples, Atash Adaran, Atash Dudga, and small Dakma multiply, integrating the state religion into the daily life of villages. On the diplomatic front, the sovereigns maintain complex relations with Christian Byzantium. Periods of peace allow Christians to build churches, while tensions lead to surveillance and persecutions. Manichaeans are forced into exile to Central Asia or Tang China, while Zoroastrian Magi strengthen their dominance. The spiritual landscape is marked by two dynamics: internal consolidation of Zoroastrianism, with major compilations like the Bundahishan, the Denkart, and the Wizidagiha-i Zadsparam, repression of groups deemed dangerous. Kartir, active under several reigns, imposes an orthodoxy aligned with royal power. Tanzar, at the start of the dynasty, seizes writings and establishes an official version of the Avesta. Both show how religion becomes a political instrument to cement an empire stretching from Mesopotamia to Central Asia. Sacred urbanism reflects this ambition. Atash Behram, with thick walls protecting the sacred fire, Dakma on hills dedicated to the dead. By associating power and priesthood, the Sasanian Empire shapes an institutionalized Zoroastrianism, which will survive in adapted forms despite later invasions. In the mid-7th century, the Sasanian Empire, which had made Zoroastrianism an institutional pillar, is struck by Islamic conquests. In 651, the capitulation of Ctesiphon, the capital located on the Tigris near present-day Baghdad, marks the end of the Sasanian state and imperial support for the Zoroastrian clergy. Ctesiphon, an administrative and religious center, housed large fire temples, Atash Behram, and liturgical archives. The Mobeds and Magush, Zoroastrian priests, held influence closely linked to the ruling dynasty. With the fall of the city, the religious hierarchy collapses. Some priests flee, others submit. The Arabs, already having a legal system for non-Muslims, apply the status of dhimmi, protection contract, to the Zoroastrians, after recognizing it for Jews and Christians. This choice is based on the recognition of a sacred text, the Avesta, and a single god, Ahura Mazda, which brings this faith closer to the Abrahamic monotheisms. Despite this relative tolerance, Zoroastrians have to pay the jizya, a tax imposed on non-Muslims. The poorest convert to Islam to avoid it, while others, attached to their faith, preserved their traditions. The cities of Yazd, Kerman, and Tabaristan in present-day northern Iran then become bastions of the Zoroastrian religion. Demographics evolve slowly. Great Zoroastrian families finance temples and renovations. Some dignitaries become scribes, doctors, or translators in the service of Muslim power. The allure of the new power and the jizya lead to conversions, causing the decline of Zoroastrianism in the Sassanid provinces. Under the Umayyads, 660 to 750, and the Abbasids, 750-1258, tolerance varies depending on the governors, creating an uncertain climate. After the fall of official institutions, the community must rely on the regularity of practices and oral transmission. The fire rites, once celebrated in vast Atash Bairams, continue in a more discreet manner. Priests, trained in the singing of the Gathas and Avestan formulas, attempt to maintain the cult despite political constraints. The Sassanid reform from the 3rd to the 6th century had imposed an official version of the Avesta. After the Islamic conquest, power fragments and community groupings ensure cohesion. In Fars and Khorasan, Pahlavi and Middle Persian are imposed in the liturgies, allowing the faithful to understand the texts, but threatening the archaic Avestan. Some priests prioritize preserving the spirit of the faith, based on good words, good thoughts, and good deeds, humata, hukta, varshta. They maintain the sacred fire, despite the dilapidation of some more modest atashgas. In the mountains and remote regions, small sanctuaries reserved for motivated faithful preserve spiritual identity. This theology of crisis generates new practices. Public ceremonies give way to private gatherings. Rich families reserve a room in their home for a sacred fire, maintained by a priest or a herbid. Elsewhere, some Zoroastrian festivals merge with Islamic customs or are reduced to avoid tensions. Yazd, in the center of Iran, became the main refuge for Zoroastrians. Dubbed the City of Towers of Silence, it still preserves dakmas, circular structures where the dead were exposed to vultures. The desert's isolation and a certain local tolerance allowed communities to preserve their customs there. Kerman and Tabaristan also hosted groups that lived for several centuries in relative peace, depending on the goodwill of Muslim governors or judges. From the 8th century onwards, the demographic decline intensified. Part of the people, weakened by wars and the Sassanid economic crisis, adopted Islam. Aristocrats converted to retain their lands or to obtain positions with the caliphal administration, often taking an Arab name. Priests lost their influence due to a lack of political and financial support, but an intellectual stronghold persisted. Literature in Pahlavi continued with historical, epic, and liturgical texts, nourishing cultural resistance. Under the Umayyad and then the Abbasid caliphs, freedom varied. Some imposed heavy taxes and discriminations like clothing marks, while others favored tolerance to maintain social peace. Forced conversions remained rare. The appeal of a majority religion, its fiscal advantages, and its prestige mainly explain the reduction in followers. Zoroastrian identity was maintained through fire rituals and the transmission of texts. Prayers in Avestan, increasingly misunderstood, were accompanied by translations in Middle Persian. Works like the Bundahishan, a cosmological treatise, or the Denkart, a doctrinal compilation, circulated in fragmentary forms in closed circles, transmitted by sacerdotal families. The atashgas, modest temples, became the heart of religious life. The sacred flame was maintained there by the priests, sometimes helped by lay people. The rituals, less lavish, had to remain discreet, but continued to attract the faithful around the fire and prayers in Avestan and Pahlavi. Over time, a close-knit community formed, centered on the training of priests from sacerdotal lineages. The families of Mobed and Herbed ensured the continuity of purity rules and the exact recitation of texts. Without a central authority, local priests held decisive moral authority. As the Abbasid era continued and various local dynasties emerged, Tahirids, Saffarids, Samanids, and then Buyids, the situation of the Zoroastrians varied by region. Some authorities tolerated their practices and even sought the help of their priests, while others imposed conversion campaigns to unify Islam. Overall, the number of practitioners slowly but surely declined. In this context, the preservation of liturgical heritage became essential. The homilies, once public, now took place in confined spaces. Fragments of the Avesta were still recited at weddings, funerals, or celebrations like Nowruz, but always away from prying eyes. The priests insisted on the strict observance of purity rituals despite the lack of resources. The retreat also reflected in the urban space. Zoroastrian homes concentrated in small enclaves, like in Yazd, where neighborhoods were organized around a fire temple. Workshops and businesses served as places of sociability, reinforcing internal cohesion, but accentuating isolation from the Muslim majority. Some exchanges, however, persisted. Some Muslim scholars studied Pahlavi and pre-Islamic history, and rare debates opposed Zoroastrian scholars and Muslim theologians. But the demographic and political weakness of the former prevented them from openly defending their ideas. The ancient imperial religion became then a cultural minority, sometimes tolerated, sometimes discriminated against, always threatened with absorption. In the 9th and 10th centuries, as the Abbasid Caliphate declined and new powers emerged, the Zoroastrians survived on the margins of upheavals. Muslim quarrels, then the Turkish and Mongol invasions, exacerbated their isolation. Economic changes and the displacement of trade routes further weakened their communities, which lost ever more faithful to Sunni Islam, or, in some regions, Shiite Islam. The preservation of the language became crucial after the collapse of the state clergy. Manuscripts in Avestan, translated into Pahlavi, were copied and transmitted clandestinely. Some priestly families dedicated themselves to this, while others emigrated to more tolerant lands. In mountainous areas, the rites quietly endured. Use of hyoma, nocturnal ceremonies around the fire, but devoid of the splendor of yore. Modern historians agree that the period from the mid-7th century to the 10th century was a decisive phase in the shaping of post-Sassanid Zoroastrianism. A small but faithful core persisted mainly around Yazd and Kerman, while most Persian provinces adopted Islam. The religion did not disappear. It survived in limited pockets thanks to the fervor of the faithful and the dedication of the priests, who preserved the essence of the faith: celebration of the fire, reading of the Avesta, practice of ritual purity. The Zoroastrians, aware of their fragility, relied on the legends of Zarathustra and the Saoshyants, future redeemers linked to the mythical lake Kansava, to persevere until the final restoration. Political catastrophes reinforced the idea of a predestined fate. Driven by a strong sense of identity, and convinced that the cosmic balance would eventually tip towards Asha, the truth, they perpetuated their faith. In Islamized Iran, their situation fell into the ambiguous status of dhimmi. On the margins of the former empire, under the domination of local powers or caliphates, Zoroastrianism continued a resilient path between rootedness and adaptation. The first movements of Zoroastrian diaspora to India appeared after the Arab Muslim conquests. To escape the pressure, some faithful reached Gujarat in western India. This community, later called Parsis or Parsis, settled between the 8th and 10th century Anno Domini near Sanjan. Confronted with Hindu and Jain influences, they had to negotiate their status and come to terms with local customs. The legend of Sanjan tells that King Jadhav Rana presented them with a bowl full of milk, symbolizing the saturation of his lands. In response, a Zoroastrian leader poured sugar into it, showing that their presence would sweeten society without overflowing it. Charmed, the king granted them hospitality, on the condition that they adopt the local language, avoid forced conversions, and respect civil customs. Gradually, they built places of worship to maintain the sacred fire and preserve their rituals. Gujarat, located on important maritime routes, favored their economic development. Engaged in the navigation and trade of spices and textiles, the Parsis earned a reputation for reliability and became trusted intermediaries between East and West. When the Mughal Empire expanded in the 16th century, they strengthened their role in supply and finance networks. Their prosperity allowed the structuring of communities around sacred fires and religious councils. During the Mughal period, from the 16th to the early 18th century, some Parsis became bankers and court merchants to the emperor and dignitaries. In recognition, the Mughal nobles sometimes granted them tax privileges and secured trade routes. Their influence also manifested in architecture, with constructions funded by Parsi notables in Surat and other ports on the west coast. Meanwhile, their philanthropic commitment was demonstrated by founding schools, hospitals, and charitable buildings open to Zoroastrians and local populations. The later British presence brought new dynamics. From the mid-18th century, the English East India Company firmly established itself in India. The Parsis, already facilitators of maritime trade, reinforced their role. In Bombay, now Mumbai, they became indispensable in naval armament, shipbuilding, and import-export. Prominent families like Wadia, Tata, Pati, or Kama prospered and contributed to urban modernization. They founded cultural institutions, promoted the arts, the press, and spread Western education. During the British Raj, many Parsis attained influential positions while preserving their religious identity. They built fire temples, codified their ritual practices, and adopted British administrative and legal elements. This prosperity in India was accompanied by dispersion towards Central Asia, notably Xinjiang and Western China. Zoroastrian communities, settled or passing through on the Silk Road, left traces in the Turfan region. Archaeological remains reveal fire temples and places of gathering. These populations, under Chinese, Turkish, or Uyghur dominance, adapted to political and economic realities, sometimes taking refuge in isolated areas. Texts mention fire rituals and liturgical techniques similar to those of Iran or India. With dynastic changes, most of these centers declined, leaving rare communities whose trace dissolved into Central Asia's cultural plurality. In parallel, from the 17th century, the West rediscovered Zoroastrianism. Merchants and travelers paved the way, followed by Jesuit missionaries keen on understanding local beliefs. The image of Zarathustra then mingled with other Eastern traditions. Missionaries, present in Goa and elsewhere in India, encountered prosperous Parsi. Theological discussions and disputes prompted them to collect documents and text fragments to send back to Europe. The real turning point came in the 18th century with Abraham Hyacinthe Anquetil Duperron. This young French linguist embarked on a journey to India in 1754 to study sacred Zoroastrian texts. After learning Persian and other local languages, he acquired manuscripts preserved by the Parsis. Returning to Europe, he published a Latin translation of the Avesta in 1771 called Zand Avesta, the first substantial presentation of these writings to the European public. His work marked a major milestone in Iranian studies and fueled scholarly interest in Eastern wisdom. In Enlightenment Europe, this discovery sparks the imagination. In France, Germany, and England, philosophers and poets are enthused by ancient Persia, sometimes perceived as a primitive monotheism or an alternative to the Abrahamic religions. Voltaire mentions Zoroaster several times to illustrate tolerance and religious diversity. At the beginning of the 19th century, Romantic Orientalism extends this fascination. Goethe, in his West Eastern Divan, evokes the wisdom of Zarathustra, contributing to the literary prestige of the prophet as an archetype of ancient and profound spirituality. Lord Byron, in his literary explorations, is seduced by images from the Orient. His interest in Iranian culture and its epics helps establish in the public mind the impression of a mysterious and grandiose world. The evocations of mages or fire priests reinforce the aura of Zarathustra as a sage, popularizing the idea of a cult of good, fighting against dark forces, often at the cost of simplifying stereotypes. This enthusiasm culminates at the end of the 19th century with Friedrich Nietzsche, who publishes Also sprach Zarathustra between 1883 and 1885. Inspired by the name and figure of the prophet, Nietzsche constructs a character bearing his vision of the superhuman and a radical transformation of values. His Zarathustra is not a faithful presentation of Zoroastrianism, but a poetic and philosophical embodiment of his reflections on morality, the will to power, and the overcoming of man. Nietzsche chooses this name because, in antiquity, Zarathustra had been credited with an original moral dualism. He thus becomes the herald of a reversal intended to reject Christian morality and any dogmatic transcendence. This appropriation, which popularized the name Zarathustra in the West, also led to confusion. Many readers, ignorant of Iranian history and the Gathas, believed they were discovering the ancient doctrine when it was a philosophical reinvention. Specialists in Zoroastrianism have often pointed out this discrepancy. The tumultuous reception of the work shows how Zoroastrian Persia served as a support for European projections. Subsequently, academic interest in the Gathas and ancient Iranian culture strengthened to differentiate the authentic heritage from romantic or philosophical interpretations.